before the Black Death came along and turned half of Europe into a ghost town. Daily life in the 14th century was already a winning combination of hard labor, questionable sanitation, and a general belief that bad luck was God's way of keeping you humble. If you imagine medieval Europe as some quaint fairy tale land of knights and castles, you're not wrong. Except replace the gallant knights with guys who haven't bathed since last harvest, and swap the castles for cold, drafty stone boxes with a rodent problem. Life expectancy? Short. Not retire at 65 short. More like don't buy green bananas short. The average person could expect to live into their 30s or 40s if they were lucky. Although lucky here meant avoiding wars, famine, disease, childbirth, and accidentally getting kicked by your own cow. But hey, at least you didn't have to worry about paying for retirement plans. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic, how the Black Death made humanity hit rock bottom, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The majority of Europeans were peasants, farmers who worked the land, paid rents or taxes to a lord, and hoped each winter wouldn't be their last. The idea of social mobility didn't really exist unless you were thinking vertically, as in falling from a ladder while thatching a roof. You were born into your station and you'd die in it, possibly in the same hut you were born in, surrounded by the same chickens. A peasant's home was usually a single room, dirt-floored hut with a thatched roof, a central hearth for cooking and heating, and a collection of animals that lived inside for warmth. Chickens, pigs, and goats were part of the family, whether you liked it or not. Modern people pay extra for farmhouse style. Medieval peasants lived it by necessity, complete with manure flooring and a smell that could knock over a bishop. Bathing was not a daily or even monthly affair for most people. While bathhouses existed in towns, especially in wealthier areas, regular folk often went years without a proper soak. Water was usually cold, rivers were often polluted, and soap was an expensive luxury made from animal fat and lye. It could clean you, yes, but it also stung like a personal insult. Clothing was washed rarely, if at all. Lice and fleas were constant companions, and scratching was practically a national pastime. Vermin didn't just live in your bed, they lived in your clothes, your hair, and occasionally in your food. But because everyone had them, nobody really complained. It's hard to feel itchy shame when the king himself is scratching under his crown. Science existed, but it was tangled with religion, astrology, and folklore in ways that would make your high school biology teacher cry. Most people believed illness came from imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, evil spirits, or bad air called miasma. If you had a headache, maybe your humors were off, or maybe you offended a saint. Either way, the cure could involve herbs, prayer, or having a hole drilled into your skull to let the badness out. Omens were taken seriously. A solar eclipse? A sure sign God was displeased. Comets? Definitely bad news. An unusually good harvest? Suspicious, probably the devil at work. Europe in the 14th century had grown since the High Middle Ages. Trade routes flourished, agriculture expanded, and more people moved into towns and cities. This meant prosperity for some, but for most, it meant you were now crammed into narrow, muddy streets where chamber pots were emptied directly into open drains. Sanitation laws were suggestions at best. Medieval cities were perfect for disease even before the plague. Houses were built close together, air circulation was non-existent, and people dumped rotting waste wherever it was most convenient, which was usually right outside their door. Animals roamed freely, adding their own contributions to the street perfume. Rats thrived in this environment, and while no one yet suspected them of being future mass murderers, they certainly weren't shy about making themselves at home. Most of Europe's economy was tied to agriculture, which made it extremely vulnerable to bad weather, crop failures, and famine. And famine wasn't a rare disaster, it was a semi-regular guest. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had killed millions only a few decades earlier, and memories of starvation were still fresh. Markets in towns were lively, but most trade was regional. Imported luxuries like spices, silk, and precious metals were reserved for the elite. For ordinary people, wealth meant owning a few tools, some livestock, and enough grain to last the winter. Lose your crop to frost or locusts, and you might spend the next year begging, stealing, or praying for better luck. For all its hardships, people didn't necessarily see their lives as miserable. It was simply the world they knew. Festivals, religious feasts, and market days brought joy. Music, storytelling, and games filled evenings. Children played in the mud, couples danced on feast days, and farmers drank ale in smoky taverns. But behind every moment of cheer lurked the constant awareness that death was never far away. This was the Europe that stood on the eve of the Black Death, a continent bustling with life but balanced on a fragile edge, where a bad harvest could mean disaster and a sniffle could mean the end. The population was dense enough for disease to spread quickly, but medicine was primitive enough to make survival a matter of sheer luck. And then, in 1347, that luck ran out. If the Black Death had a travel blog, it would have been called Around the World in 80 Million Corpses. The 14th century didn't have planes, trains, or Amazon delivery, but it did have something almost as efficient, a web of bustling trade routes stretching from China to Europe, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and unbeknownst to anyone, the deadliest bacteria in human history. The disease's chosen chariot was Yersinia pestis, a microscopic hitchhiker with no grand plan other than to ruin everything it touched. This wasn't the kind of pest you could shoo away with a broom. You couldn't see it, smell it, or suspect it. It just hitched rides on unsuspecting hosts, making the Silk Road the medieval equivalent of an express train straight to mass extinction. The merchants of the time thought they were bringing home luxury goods. In reality, they were delivering one of the greatest catastrophes the world had ever seen. The story begins far from Europe, somewhere in the Central Asian steppes, where humans, animals, and parasites mingled freely. Fleas, particularly Xenopsilla chiopis, were the perfect middlemen for plague transmission. They thrived on rats, and rats thrived on human settlements, food stores, and anything vaguely edible. When rats died in droves from the plague, their fleas needed new real estate. Humans, unfortunately, were prime beachfront property. The Silk Road was the perfect plague superhighway. This sprawling network of caravan trails and maritime routes allowed silk from China to reach Paris, spices from India to reach Venice, and diseases from anywhere to reach everywhere. Traders traveled with animals, animals carried fleas, fleas carried Yersinia pestis, and no customs official was checking luggage for biological hazards. Ships from the east docked in ports along the Mediterranean, their holds filled with grain for the rats to nibble on and cozy spaces for fleas to bide their time before making the jump to their next victim. Your cargo, silk, spices, and just a little global catastrophe. But if trade routes were the superhighway, the Mongols may have been the on-ramp that sped the disease into Europe's bloodstream. The Mongol Empire, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Its vast reach connected people, goods, and ideas, and unfortunately pathogens. One of the most infamous events tied to the plague's arrival in Europe happened in 1346 during the Mongol siege of Kaffa, a Genoese-controlled port on the Crimean Peninsula. According to accounts from the time, Mongol forces besieging Kaffa began dying from a mysterious, horrifying disease. In a moment of either military genius or deeply questionable ethics, they allegedly catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the city walls. The defenders, understandably horrified, found themselves surrounded not just by enemy soldiers, but by a rain of rotting, infected bodies. If this story is accurate, it might be one of the earliest recorded examples of biological warfare medieval style. The Genoese, desperate to escape, fled Kaffa by ship, carrying with them not just their belongings, but the invisible killer that had just devastated their attackers. From there, it was only a matter of time. Those ships, infested with rats and fleas, made their way to ports around the Mediterranean: Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, Marseille. The disease moved faster than the rumors about it, and that's saying something in a century when gossip could cross a village in under an hour. Ships would arrive in harbor with most of their crew dead or dying, yet they still unloaded their goods. The rats didn't need permission to disembark. They simply scurried into the streets, bringing their fleas along for the ride. The Mediterranean wasn't the only gateway. The plague also crept along overland routes, following armies, caravans, and pilgrims. In a world without germ theory, no one suspected the true culprits. People thought it might be bad air, angry gods, or poisoned wells. Nobody looked at the rat nibbling grain in the corner and thought, "You're the reason my neighbors are dropping like flies." That particular revelation was still centuries away. What made this phase of the plague's journey so effective was the sheer interconnectedness of the 14th century world. We often imagine the medieval period as isolated, slow-moving, and stagnant, but by the mid-1300s, Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa were linked in a surprisingly dynamic global network. Goods, people, and news traveled constantly, and so did diseases. The Mongol Empire's stability made long-distance travel safer than it had been in centuries, ironically creating the perfect conditions for a disease to move farther, faster, and deadlier than ever before. By late 1347, the plague had its beachhead in Europe. From there, it would surge inland, leaving behind towns where silence replaced the clamor of markets, and streets where the only movement came from rats darting between abandoned houses. The stage was set for one of the most rapid and devastating population collapses in recorded history. But for now, in this chapter, it's enough to understand that the Black Death didn't sneak into Europe through one single door. It stormed in through every entrance at once. It was the unwanted passenger on merchant ships, the silent stowaway in grain sacks, the uninvited guest following caravan trains, and the grim gift that armies unknowingly delivered. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the disease was already everywhere it needed to be to bring a continent to its knees. Next, we'll see what happened when that invisible killer finally made its debut on European soil. The moment when everyday life turned into a rolling nightmare that no one could escape. When the Black Death first landed in Europe in 1347, it didn't stroll politely into town, knock on a few doors, and wait to be noticed. It hit like a battering ram, racing through the continent with the speed and enthusiasm of a tavern rumour. In port cities, it appeared as if death had stepped off the gangplank alongside the merchants, and within weeks the disease was moving inland with a determination that would put a tax collector to shame. The earliest European victims were in coastal trading hubs, places like Messina in Sicily, Marseille in France, and Genoa in Italy. These ports were the lifeblood of commerce, packed with sailors, merchants, dock workers, and all the rats and fleas a deadly bacterium could dream of. The plague moved through these populations like fire in dry straw. Sick crewmen would collapse on the docks, and by the time anyone realized it wasn't just a bad case of sea legs, half the harbour district was coughing, bleeding, or too dead to complain. The pace of spread was breathtaking. Modern historians estimate the plague could travel up to a mile per day in densely populated areas, which in the 14th century was nothing short of terrifying. Caravans, peddlers, and travellers carried it along roads and riverways, while boats ferried it across short sea passages. In a matter of months, the Black Death reached inland cities, small market towns, and eventually the most remote villages. Places that had never seen a merchant ship still found themselves suddenly hosting an invisible killer. Containing it was impossible for two reasons. First, no one knew what they were dealing with. The concept of germs was centuries away, so authorities didn't understand that the real culprits were fleas and rats. Second, medieval Europe was a network of tightly connected communities. Even small towns depended on regular markets, fairs, and pilgrimages, all of which guaranteed a constant flow of people in and out, perfect for a pathogen looking for new hosts. In some cities, panic set in almost immediately. Town gates were closed to strangers, markets were suspended, and travellers were turned away at the outskirts. But human desperation has always been a stubborn thing. Merchants wanted to sell goods, pilgrims wanted to reach holy sites, and refugees wanted to escape infected areas. The result was a constant churn of movement, with sick and healthy alike mingling on the roads. In trying to run from the plague, many people carried it with them, unknowingly delivering it to new communities. One of the most chilling features of the first wave was its sheer unpredictability. A village could be healthy one week and nearly deserted the next. In some cases, the plague appeared in a household and wiped it out before neighbors even knew they were ill. Medieval quarantine measures were crude at best. The most common tactic was to lock the sick inside their homes and hope the disease burned itself out. If the patient recovered, it was a miracle. If they died, well, at least they hadn't infected the neighbors. This was public health in the 14th century, nailing the sick inside their house and hoping for the best. Authorities reacted in wildly different ways, often depending on who was in charge. Some city councils organized patrols to enforce curfews, forbade gatherings, and ordered the burning of corrupted goods like bedding and clothing. Others turned to religious processions and public prayers, filling the streets with crowds, which of course made things worse. There was no playbook, and each community improvised with whatever knowledge, superstition, and desperation they had. The social impact was immediate. Trade slowed to a crawl as markets emptied and merchants either fled or died. Agricultural work suffered as fields went untended, not because of famine this time, but because entire families were bedridden or buried. In urban centers, the rhythm of life broke down. Shops stayed shuttered, streets grew eerily quiet except for the tolling of church bells, and funeral processions became so frequent they were no longer solemn events, just part of the day's background noise. Even the wealthy, normally insulated from peasant misfortunes, discovered their privileges had limits. Infected servants could bring the plague into manors and palaces just as easily as into hovels. The rich tried fleeing to country estates, but in an age when country meant more rats, more fleas, and fewer doctors, it wasn't much of an improvement. Some nobles did manage to survive by isolating themselves, but their absence often left cities leaderless at the worst possible moment. The psychological toll was just as severe as the physical one. The first wave of the Black Death shattered the sense of safety people had in their communities. Neighbors avoided each other, families refused to care for sick relatives, and trust in local leaders eroded as their orders failed to stop the dying. A sickness that killed quickly was terrifying enough. A sickness that struck without warning, in every class and every profession, turned daily life into a gamble no one wanted to play. By the time the first wave had rolled across much of Europe, the population's morale had already collapsed. People had seen bustling marketplaces turn into empty squares, homes boarded up with entire families inside, and priests unable to keep pace with the burials. The speed of the plague didn't just kill people, it killed the rhythm of life itself. Europe had been used to hardship, but this was different. This was not a bad harvest or a war in the next valley. This was something that made the very air feel unsafe. The Black Death had announced itself with a swiftness and scale that no one in Europe had ever witnessed, and tragically, it was only getting started. The worst part was yet to come, the horrifying symptoms that made even the most stoic medieval peasants wish for a quick end. If you were unlucky enough to draw the Black Death ticket in the 14th century, you didn't just get a cold or a bad cough, you got a front row seat to one of nature's most horrifying performance pieces, starring your own body as the collapsing stage. There wasn't just one version of the plague, there were 3 headliners, each with its own method of making you regret every decision that had led to this moment. Bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. They were like the medieval equivalent of a choose-your-fighter screen in a video game. Except no matter which you picked, you were going to lose. The most famous, and arguably the face of the Black Death, was the bubonic plague. This one was spread primarily by flea bites, which is medieval speak for blame the rats, but also the tiny vampires living on them. Once inside you, Yersinia pestis, the bacterial mastermind behind the whole disaster, set up camp in your lymphatic system. Within days, your lymph nodes, particularly around your groin, armpits, and neck, began to swell to the size of eggs, then apples, then something you didn't want to compare to food ever again. These swellings, or buboes, were often black or purple, hot to the touch, and so painful that people would beg friends, family, or anyone within arm's reach to lance them. Whether that helped is debatable, but it certainly ruined dinner for anyone watching. Death rates for the bubonic plague hovered around 60%, which in medieval Europe might as well have been a coin toss, except the coin was on fire and aimed at your face. If bubonic plague was the infamous celebrity, septimic plague was the serial killer who worked quietly but efficiently. This form occurred when the bacteria skipped the scenic lymph node route and went straight for your bloodstream. The symptoms escalated with terrifying speed: fever, chills, abdominal pain and vomiting. Within hours, your skin could develop dark patches of necrosis as blood vessels collapsed. This is where the Black in Black death really got its branding. Septicemic victims looked as if their skin had been bruised by a vengeful god. The death rate for septicemic plague was effectively 100% without treatment, and since treatment in the 14th century amounted to try leeches or pray harder, survival was not on the menu. People often died the same day symptoms appeared, making it the medieval equivalent of a one-punch knockout. Then there was pneumonic plague, the form that decided, why stop with killing you? Let's also make you a walking bioweapon. This strain infected the lungs, producing a cough that sprayed bacteria into the air like the world's least welcome perfume. Symptoms began with fever and headache, followed by coughing fits, so violent they could cause rib injuries. Soon the coughs turned bloody, and breathing became a desperate, drowning struggle. Pneumonic plague could kill within 2 to 3 days, but the real horror was its contagiousness. You didn't need fleas or rats for this one, just a shared room, a conversation, or even a sneeze in your general direction. And congratulations, you were next in line. Of course, medieval Europe didn't have germ theory, so people invented their own explanations. Some thought the plague was carried by miasma, bad air rising from rotting matter, swamps, or possibly their neighbors. Others believed it was caused by an imbalance in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much of one, the cure might involve purging, bloodletting, or consuming substances that today would get a food safety inspector fired. Then there were the cosmic theories that the plague came from an unusual alignment of the planets, or from a poisonous mist released during an earthquake, or because God had finally run out of patience with humanity's nonsense. When symptoms appeared, fear moved faster than the disease. Entire households locked themselves away. Others fled the city at the first sign of a neighbor coughing. Plague doctors, clad in their now famous beaked masks stuffed with herbs, strolled around looking like oversized ominous birds, hoping the scent of lavender and rosemary would filter out the death in the air. It didn't. The masks worked about as well as holding your breath at a campfire, which is to say, not at all. For the unlucky, the onset of symptoms was like watching a storm cloud build inside their own body. The agony from buboes, the skin blackening from septicemia, the choking coughs of pneumonic plague, each was a different form of the same sentence, a death notice with no appeal process. And yet, people still tried everything from magical amulets to sitting between roaring fires to sweat out the sickness, in a desperate bid for survival. If you were looking for a moment to invent modern medicine, this would have been it. But unfortunately, humanity was still a few centuries and countless corpses away from antibiotics. The Black Death symptoms didn't just kill, they terrified. They left survivors scarred in ways that went beyond the physical. Seeing a loved one's body swell, darken, and fail in a matter of days imprinted the plague into the medieval imagination as a supernatural terror, not just an illness, but a judgment, a curse, a punishment. And if nature was a lottery, the 14th century had just hit the worst jackpot in human history. If you were unlucky enough to catch the plague in the 14th century, your odds of survival were already slim. But if you then went to a medieval doctor, those odds didn't improve much. In fact, they might have gotten worse, though at least you could take comfort in the fact that everyone else was just as clueless. The world of medieval medicine was a curious mix of ancient Greek theory, Christian theology, and a dash of "I saw my neighbor try this once and it sort of worked until he died." Physicians at the time worked under the shadow of Galen and Hippocrates, ancient medical authorities whose ideas were about as up-to-date as a Roman sundial. Central to their thinking was the four humours theory. Your health depended on a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your humours were out of balance, and the logical solution was to rebalance them. The fastest way to do this: remove some of the offending humour. Translation: prepare to be bled. Bloodletting was the crown jewel of plague treatment. Physicians believed that if you drained enough blood, you could remove the corruption from the body. In practice, this was a great way to make a dangerously weak patient even weaker. Barber surgeons. Yes, the same people who cut your hair often handled the procedure using leeches or knives to open veins. You might have come in coughing up blood, but you'd leave pale, dizzy, and possibly missing a pint or two. For those who preferred a gentler touch, there were herbal remedies. Physicians and apothecaries prescribed mixtures of rosemary, sage, wormwood, or rue, often wrapped in cloth to be sniffed throughout the day. These posies weren't entirely useless. They smelled better than a plague-ridden street, but they did little to stop the Yersinia pestis bacterium. Some doctors suggested drinking herbal infusions, which at least offered hydration, though they sometimes came spiked with ingredients like crushed emeralds. Yes, you read that right. If the plague didn't kill you, the lead impurities in your gemstone tea might. Then there was the ever-popular burning of incense. Streets and homes were filled with the smoke of juniper, pine, and frankincense, based on the belief that bad smells carried disease, the miasma theory. If you could overpower the stink of rotting bodies, you might just avoid catching the illness, or so they thought. In reality, incense offered about as much protection as holding your breath and hoping for divine intervention. Religious cures were perhaps the most dramatic. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, so treatment involved repentance. Pilgrimages to holy sites, processions through towns, and public flagellation became common. The flagellants groups who whipped themselves to atone for the world's sins marched from city to city, chanting and bleeding. They may have been sincere, but they were also fantastic carriers of the disease, unknowingly spreading it wherever they went. The church itself offered blessings, holy water, and relics, though these worked about as well as any other method, which is to say, not at all. Of course, not all remedies came from physicians or priests. Folk healers and cunning women practiced their own forms of plague medicine, often combining herbal knowledge with magical charms. Amulets containing dried toads, powdered gemstones, or even bits of scripture were worn to ward off illness. Some recommended rubbing onions or live chickens on plague sores. The logic? The disease would pass from you into the chicken. Unfortunately for the chicken, it usually just ended up dead, and so did the patient. And then there were the protective clothing experiments, early forerunners of hazmat suits. Some healers wrapped themselves in waxed cloth, thinking it would keep out the poisoned air. Others wore full-body coverings doused in vinegar. The famous plague doctor costume, with its beaked mask, didn't actually appear until the 17th century. But the 14th century had its own versions of odd headgear and face coverings. Sadly, none of these protected against flea bites. If you had money, you could pay for a private physician to attend you at home. They'd arrive in their finest robes, diagnose your humoral imbalance, and prescribe a regimen of purging, fasting, and maybe a dash of mercury ointment. If you were poor, you got the community healer or a barber surgeon, whose tools were rarely cleaned and whose medical degree might have been a rumor. By modern standards, medieval plague medicine was a hopeless guessing game. But in fairness, the science to understand bacteria and transmission simply didn't exist yet. Without microscopes, germ theory, or antibiotics, all people could do was throw everything they had at the disease, whether that was bleeding, herbs, smoke, or prayer, and hope something stuck. Spoiler, nothing did. The result was a tragic irony. Many treatments hastened death, either through infection from unsanitary tools, poisoning from medicinal substances, or simply weakening an already failing body. And yet, in the absence of alternatives, people clung to these methods. After all, doing anything felt better than doing nothing, even if that something involved applying a dead animal to your swollen lymph nodes. In the medieval medical marketplace, the cure might kill you faster than the disease, but at least it was affordable. That's not to say it was cheap. Herbs, incense, and leeches still cost money, but you didn't have to worry about the hospital sending you an itemized bill for $40,000. Your only invoice was from your local gravedigger. If the Black Death killed swiftly, human suspicion worked even faster. In the 14th century, people had no microscopes, no germ theory, and frankly no patience for logical explanations. They couldn't see Yersinia pestis lurking in fleas, but they could see their neighbors, and blaming them felt much more satisfying than blaming invisible specks of bacteria. As towns emptied and bodies piled up, Europe's fear became the perfect fuel for a wildfire of scapegoating. When people are terrified and clueless, they tend to reach for the simplest explanation, ideally one with a face they can point to. For many communities, that face belonged to Jewish populations scattered across Europe. Medieval anti-Semitism was already strong before the plague, but now it found a fresh excuse to sharpen its pitchforks. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, spreading magic powders, or otherwise conspiring to kill Christians. Never mind that Jewish communities were also dying from the plague. Paranoia works on a selective fact diet. The accusations spiraled into violence. In 1348, Strasbourg saw one of the most notorious pogroms of the plague era. Thousands of Jews were rounded up, burned alive, or expelled from the city, and this wasn't an isolated event. Similar atrocities unfolded across Germany, France, and Spain. Entire Jewish neighborhoods were obliterated not by disease but by mobs convinced they were purging evil. The cruel irony, destroying communities only further disrupted local economies, trade, and medicine, making the plague's impact even worse. Fear wasn't just cruel, it was counterproductive. But the blame game didn't stop at religion. Outsiders in general were suspicious targets. Traveling merchants, foreigners, even wandering friars sometimes found themselves accused of being plague bringers. In an age where passports didn't exist, a strange accent or unfamiliar clothes could make you guilty on sight. If you weren't one of us, you were a suspect, and if you were already poor, marginalized, or politically unpopular, the plague became the perfect excuse to get rid of you. Religion poured more fuel onto the fire, but not always intentionally. Many priests and preachers sincerely believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. That meant someone, somewhere, had made God very angry, and until the guilty were punished, the suffering would continue. This message was often mixed with public displays of piety, from candlelit processions to the terrifying flagellants, traveling bands of zealots who whipped themselves bloody to atone for the world's sins. These processions didn't exactly improve public health. Large gatherings of people chanting, bleeding, and coughing were essentially medieval superspreader events. And yet, for many, the flagellants offered a strange comfort. If you could see someone doing something about the plague, even if that something was self-inflicted torture, it gave the illusion of control. Better to believe that pain and penance could stop the plague than to admit no one knew what was happening. The human mind hates a vacuum, and when science was absent, superstition happily moved in and redecorated. Of course, blaming others had the convenient side effect of distracting from more mundane problems like the rats, fleas, and appalling hygiene practices in the cities. It's much easier to shout at your neighbor than to clean your streets or admit that the waste pit outside your house might be a bacterial Disneyland. The medieval mindset didn't think in terms of public health so much as public sin. The solution wasn't sanitation, it was punishment. This culture of fear wasn't just destructive in the short term, it reshaped communities for decades. Jewish populations in many areas were permanently reduced, either through slaughter or forced migration. Trade routes changed as merchants avoided cities known for violent outbursts. Distrust between towns, regions, and religious groups deepened, setting the stage for future conflicts long after the plague had burned through. The tragedy is that the plague didn't discriminate, whether you were Christian, Jewish, Muslim, rich, poor, merchant or peasant. The disease treated you with equal indifference, but fear blinded people to that reality. It turned shared suffering into suspicion, and suspicion into violence. The rats might have carried the fleas, but humanity carried the blame. Why blame rats when you can blame your neighbor? After all, the rats didn't look at you funny in the market or haggle you down on the price of bread. They just nibbled in the shadows, innocent in appearance, quietly moving the apocalypse from one village to the next. People, on the other hand, made much louder, easier targets. And in the medieval blame lottery, the winning prize was often a torch-wielding mob. The Black Death wasn't just a public health disaster. It was a sledgehammer to the medieval social order, with anywhere from a third to half of Europe's population gone in just a few short years. Every sector of society felt the aftershocks. The first and most immediate impact was on the workforce. Farmers, craftsmen, dock workers, shepherds and servants were wiped out in staggering numbers, leaving behind empty fields, silent workshops and estates that could no longer function. Lords and landowners who once had more peasants than they knew what to do with suddenly found themselves with no one to plough their land or tend their livestock. This shortage turned the feudal system upside down. In pre-plague days, peasants were tied to their lords through labor obligations and had little bargaining power. But when surviving workers realized just how valuable they had become, they began demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and, in some cases, outright freedom from their feudal obligations. Imagine a medieval farmer suddenly realizing he was the equivalent of a superstar athlete in the labor market. He could essentially name his price. Landowners didn't take kindly to this sudden shift in the balance of power, but without workers they had no choice. The bargaining table had moved, and so had the peasants' chairs. The effects rippled through the economy. With fewer people to work the land, agricultural output plummeted, food shortages became common, and basic staples skyrocketed in price. This was especially ironic because in many regions there was actually more land available than ever before, but without hands to work it, all that fertile soil was useless. Livestock herds roamed untended, crops withered in the fields, and orchards went unpicked. Some landowners resorted to converting farmland into pasture for sheep, which required fewer workers but further reduced grain supplies, making bread, the cornerstone of the medieval diet, even more expensive. Urban centers felt the squeeze too. The death toll in cities was often higher than in rural areas, which meant entire trades could collapse overnight. A single plague outbreak could wipe out an entire guild of bakers or blacksmiths, leaving towns without essential services. Merchant families that had dominated trade for generations sometimes vanished entirely, and their wealth either dissolved or fell into the hands of distant relatives who may have been more interested in buying fancy clothes than maintaining a shipping empire. The flow of goods slowed and markets became unpredictable. If you wanted wool one week, you might find none available. The next week it might flood the market because no one could weave it into cloth. Meanwhile, those who survived, especially in cities, suddenly found themselves inheriting property, money, and land from dead relatives. This redistribution of wealth was unprecedented. Some former peasants became property owners almost overnight, but with wealth came new responsibilities and, for many, new dangers. A poor man who had never owned more than a wooden spoon might suddenly be the target of thieves after inheriting his cousin's estate. Social mobility, while rare before the plague, became a genuine possibility, but it came wrapped in equal parts opportunity and risk. Governments tried to rein in the chaos. In England, for example, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from leaving their lords in search of better pay. On paper it looked like an easy fix. In reality it was about as effective as nailing a door shut to keep the wind out. Workers ignored it, lords bent the rules, and enforcement was spotty at best. This tension between labour and authority would simmer for decades, eventually boiling over into uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In the long term, the Black Death didn't just dent the economy, it reshaped it. The labor shortages weakened the foundations of feudalism, paving the way for a wage-based economy and, eventually, a middle class. Guilds reorganized to accommodate smaller numbers of skilled workers, trade routes adjusted, and land ownership patterns shifted dramatically. But in the immediate aftermath, the mood was less about building a brighter future and more about surviving the day-to-day chaos. And yet, through all this upheaval, one strange truth emerged. Some survivors actually found themselves better off than before. A farmer might have more land to farm, a craftsman could charge more for his work, and even servants could demand better treatment. But this came at an unthinkable cost. The empty homes, overgrown fields, and abandoned villages were constant reminders of the price paid for that newfound prosperity. The funny part, if you can call it that, was the grim irony of it all. You finally got a pay raise, but only because everyone else was dead. In a society that had been rigid and hierarchical for centuries, the plague had quite literally leveled the playing field, though perhaps not in the way anyone would have wanted. When the Black Death rolled through Europe, it wasn't just bodies piling up, it was also faith being quietly and sometimes loudly dismantled. For centuries, the medieval church had been the rock of society, the all-knowing authority that could explain everything from the mysteries of the afterlife to why your neighbor's cow stopped producing milk. But when the plague arrived, that rock started to crack. At first, people turned to the church for answers. Priests delivered sermons warning that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, a divine spanking meant to whip Europe back into moral shape. This explanation had a certain medieval logic to it. If bad things happen, it's because God is angry. Simple, satisfying, and conveniently unprovable. But as the weeks turned into months, and the death toll climbed to catastrophic levels, those who clung to faith were confronted with a devastating reality. The holy men themselves were dying in droves. Clergy were supposed to be God's frontline workers, armed with blessings, holy water, and the occasional relic to ward off disaster. Yet the Black Death tore through monasteries and convents with brutal efficiency. Priests went to minister to the sick and, all too often, ended up becoming patients themselves. Many parish churches lost their entire staff, leaving towns without anyone to hear confessions, perform last rites, or even ring the church bells for funerals. In some regions, desperate communities resorted to hiring anyone who could recite a prayer, literacy optional, to stand in for a dead priest. The devastation among the clergy also had a less spiritual but equally damaging effect: corruption and incompetence. With so many trained priests gone, the church began to lower its hiring standards. Suddenly, men who previously wouldn't have been trusted to guard the communion wine were being ordained. The result was a noticeable drop in the quality of sermons, moral discipline, and frankly, customer satisfaction. Imagine expecting a holy man and getting a part-time shepherd who thought Latin was a type of bread. This crisis of competence eroded the church's authority. If the priests didn't seem any closer to God than the butcher or the miller, why should people continue to obey them without question? Theologians struggled to explain why a loving God would let such indiscriminate suffering happen. The old answers that plague was punishment for sin started to sound hollow when babies and pious monks died as quickly as thieves and drunkards. For many, the plague was proof that the spiritual safety net was full of holes. Out of this void of trust emerged alternative religious movements, some peaceful, others extreme. The most infamous were the flagellants, bands of zealots who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a dramatic display of repentance. Dressed in rags and chanting hymns, they drew massive crowds. For a while they were seen as holy warriors against the plague, but their theology was self-made, and their public spectacles sometimes incited riots or paranoia. The church, already bleeding credibility, viewed them as dangerous competition and moved to suppress them, though not before their influence spread across much of Europe. Meanwhile, in private homes and whispered conversations, more radical thoughts began to grow. If the church could not protect people from death, maybe it didn't hold all the answers after all. This was not yet the full-blown skepticism of the Renaissance, but seeds were being planted. Wealthy patrons who once donated to monasteries began funding hospitals or universities instead. Ordinary villagers who once feared speaking against the priest now muttered that perhaps salvation wasn't as straightforward as weekly confession and tithes. Ironically, even as faith wavered, religious rituals multiplied. People clung to processions, pilgrimages and blessings, not necessarily because they believed they worked, but because doing something, anything, felt better than doing nothing. In cities where corpses lay unburied, processions of barefoot penitents wound through the streets, chanting prayers while stepping over the dead. The image was powerful, heartbreaking, and unfortunately completely ineffective against the plague. The Church's crisis during the Black Death was not a total collapse. It would remain a dominant force for centuries, but the veneer of invincibility was gone. No longer could it claim to have all the answers, or to stand untouchable in the face of worldly disaster. Faith had been shaken, not shattered, but the cracks were permanent. The funny part, if you were sitting in a pew in 1349 and your priest coughed mid-sermon, the first thought wasn't "God bless him," but time to find another church, preferably one without such a high turnover rate. When the Black Death finally loosened its bony grip on Europe in the late 14th century, the survivors emerged into a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. The countryside was littered with abandoned villages, urban streets echoed with an eerie quiet, and once thriving marketplaces now looked like ghost towns. This was not a recovery in the traditional sense. This was the slow, awkward rebirth of a world that had been gutted and stitched back together in entirely new ways. Estimates suggest that Europe lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population. And that kind of demographic hit is like pulling the Jenga block that keeps the whole tower standing. Entire family lines vanished overnight, trade networks broke down, and vast swaths of farmland sat empty because there simply weren't enough living hands to work them. In some regions, forests began reclaiming plowed fields, and wolves, wild boar, and other wildlife made a comeback, an unplanned medieval rewilding project. Cities fared no better. While some urban centers rebounded thanks to trade and migration, others were permanently diminished. Small towns that lost their economic base never recovered, fading from maps entirely. The Europe that rose from the ashes was smaller, but oddly enough in some ways more prosperous for those who had survived. Here's where things took a surprising turn. For peasants and laborers, the plague was an economic plot twist worthy of a medieval soap opera. With so few workers left, landowners and city employers suddenly found themselves desperate for manpower. This meant wages went up, labor contracts improved, and tenants could negotiate better terms for their leases. Some serfs even bought their freedom outright, not out of generosity from their lords, but because the lords simply couldn't afford to say no. It's no exaggeration to say that the plague accelerated the decline of feudalism. The rigid social hierarchy, already creaking under economic pressures, began to crumble as people realized they had bargaining power for the first time. It was a moment in history when you might actually smile while shoveling manure because you knew the guy paying you was twice as desperate as you were. With so many heirs dead, vast estates were consolidated into fewer hands, sometimes creating mega landlords who wielded enormous influence. But wealth also trickled down in unexpected ways. If you were the last surviving relative, congratulations, you just inherited your cousin's farm, house, and goat herd. Property laws had to adapt to these sudden shifts, and in many cases, women who had been overlooked in inheritance matters found themselves landowners and business managers by necessity. This redistribution of resources reshaped communities. Formerly poor families climbed the social ladder, and while the rich stayed rich, the middle tiers of society began to swell. In short, the medieval economy looked like someone had shaken a snow globe. All the pieces were still there, but they'd landed in new and strange places. The trauma of the plague didn't just change bank accounts, it rewired the way people thought about life and death. Pre-plague art often focused on religious devotion and the glory of the afterlife, but in the aftermath, themes of mortality, the fragility of existence, and earthly pleasures became more prominent. The famous danse macabre, the dance of death, became a popular motif in paintings, murals, and literature, reminding viewers that no matter your station in life, death would eventually cut in and lead you off the dance floor. Writers, too, shifted their focus. Some works became darker and more contemplative, while others leaned into humor and satire as a coping mechanism. Life was short, so you might as well laugh, even if it was a slightly grim laugh. Survivors were not the same people they had been before the plague. Many had lost faith in institutions, both religious and political, that had failed to protect them. This skepticism laid early groundwork for social and intellectual changes that would blossom in later centuries, from Renaissance humanism to questioning the authority of the Church. Communities also became more self-reliant. The trauma of being cut off from distant authorities during outbreaks encouraged towns and villages to handle their own governance, defense, and health measures. This fostered a stronger sense of local identity and, in some places, early stirrings of civic pride. By the late 14th century, Europe was not healed. That would take generations, but it was undeniably transformed. In many ways, the survivors were pioneers, not of a new land, but of a reshaped world. And while rebuilding with only 3 people and a goat might sound absurd, it wasn't far from reality in some villages. Those who remained had to learn trades they'd never practiced before, shoulder responsibilities they'd never imagined, and adapt to a social order that no longer looked like the one they'd been born into. The Black Death had been the ultimate reset button, brutal, indiscriminate, and irreversible. In its wake, humanity rebuilt, reimagined, and perhaps most importantly, remembered. Because after all, if history teaches us anything, it's that life after catastrophe is never the same, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's unexpectedly better for the survivors. The Black Death wasn't just a disaster, it was the single deadliest health crisis in recorded history, wiping out somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population. That's not a plague, that's a historical mic drop, and while you'd think an event that catastrophic would fundamentally change the way humans approached medicine, sanitation, and disease prevention forever, well, we sort of learned, temporarily, until the next pandemic came knocking and everyone went back to miasma theories and garlic necklaces. In the immediate aftermath, Europe was a very different place. Whole towns had vanished, farms lay abandoned, and trade routes were quiet. In some ways, the plague forced progress. Fewer people meant more land and resources for survivors, which helped break the old feudal structures in certain regions. Labor became more valuable, and peasants, those who hadn't been nailed inside their houses, could suddenly demand better wages or conditions. Urban planning also shifted. Cities that rebuilt after the plague often widened streets, improved drainage, and even banned certain livestock from living within city walls. This wasn't because people suddenly understood germ theory. It was because the smell of disease-ridden streets was so bad that even medieval noses couldn't take it anymore. But the most important shift was in mindset. The plague had shown that death didn't respect wealth, titles, or holiness. A king could die just as quickly as a beggar. That realization shook the medieval worldview, making space for new ideas in science, art, and philosophy. Though they didn't have the language for it yet, medieval societies began experimenting with public health measures. Quarantine became an actual policy rather than a panicked improvisation. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. The period ships had to remain isolated before docking in plague-affected ports like Venice. Sanitation laws started popping up too. Cities began regulating waste disposal, cleaning streets more regularly, and banning certain trades from operating in crowded markets. It was baby steps, but compared to the pre-plague throw your garbage out the window and let the pigs deal with it era, it was revolutionary. Unfortunately, these measures were often reactive rather than preventative. People were more likely to act when corpses started piling up, not before. The Black Death offers lessons we still need to hear. First, act early. Medieval authorities often hesitated to impose quarantines or restrict trade for fear of economic loss. Sound familiar? By the time they acted, the plague had already raced ahead. Second, misinformation kills. In the 14th century, false beliefs about disease spread led to mass persecution of Jews, foreigners, and anyone seen as unclean. In modern times, misinformation might not lead to pogroms, at least not in most countries, but it can still fuel prejudice and undermine health measures. Third, disease doesn't care about borders. The plague traveled along trade routes and merchant ships, ignoring political lines entirely. In today's globalized world, the same principle applies. Viruses fly business class if they have to. Finally, public trust is everything. When people trust their leaders and health systems, they follow advice. In the 14th century, that trust collapsed alongside the Church's moral authority. In the modern day, that collapse can happen on social media in a matter of hours. For centuries after the Black Death, Europe couldn't forget. The event left deep scars, not just in population statistics but in art, literature and religion. Skeletons and dancing corpses, the dance macabre, appeared in paintings and murals. Writers described life as fleeting, fragile and filled with uncertainty. Church sermons leaned heavily on the death is always near theme, just in case anyone had started feeling too cheerful. The plague became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that society could unravel in months. Even in times of relative peace, people carried that fear in the back of their minds. The next outbreak, whether plague, smallpox or cholera, was never a question of if, but when. Here's the thing. Humans are historically bad at remembering hard-earned lessons for more than a couple of generations. The Black Death did inspire improvements in sanitation, quarantine policies and medical study, but those advances weren't universal, and they didn't stick everywhere. By the time the plague returned in later centuries, because of course it did, many places were caught just as unprepared as before. Still, its legacy can't be denied. The Black Death was a turning point, a grim teacher that forced societies to confront the realities of disease, mortality, and the limits of human control. And while we may not have mastered all its lessons, we've at least kept a few, like the importance of clean water, waste management, and maybe not blaming the nearest outsider when things go wrong. It took killing a third of Europe to figure out that washing your hands might help. And even then, it took another 5 centuries for soap to really catch on. Long before quilted, double-ply softness became a basic human right, our ancestors had to improvise. And by improvise, I mean they grabbed whatever was nearby, applied it to the situation and hoped for the best. This was an age before plumbing, before porcelain thrones, and let's be honest, before the concept of personal space in the bathroom. If you had to go, you did so wherever survival and common sense intersected, which was not very often. In the prehistoric world, wiping wasn't a carefully considered hygiene ritual. It was an afterthought at best. You had bigger concerns, like not being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, finding enough calories to make it through the day, and making sure the neighboring tribe didn't steal your fire. In that context, what you used to clean your behind wasn't exactly a top priority. It's not that prehistoric people didn't know about comfort. It's that comfort wasn't in the budget. The great thing about living in a world untouched by industry was that nature provided plenty of options for wiping. The bad thing, nature didn't exactly offer a returns policy. Leaves were an obvious go-to. They were softish, biodegradable, and conveniently placed right next to the bushes you were probably squatting behind. Of course, identification skills were key. Mix up your leaf selection and you might find yourself wiping with poison ivy, which transforms your day from slightly uncomfortable to call the village shaman immediately. For those in coastal areas, seashells were apparently an option, which feels like the prehistoric equivalent of using a cheese grater on a balloon. You have to admire the creativity, but one wrong move and you'd remember that bathroom trip for life. Sand was also common in desert environments, doubling as both a wiping agent and an exfoliant, because why not start your skincare routine from the ground up? In colder climates, moss was a favored choice. It was soft, absorbent, and readily available, assuming you didn't mind introducing whatever microscopic critters lived inside it. to your most private ecosystem. Snow could also do the job, but that came with an obvious downside: shock therapy. Believe it or not, some cultures, especially nomadic ones, practiced what you might call the let nature take care of it method. If your clothing was minimal and you weren't in close quarters with others, you could theoretically just walk it off. Time, wind, and the occasional river crossing would handle the rest. This wasn't necessarily laziness. It was a practical decision when you were traveling light and hygiene products weren't a thing. Some early groups also subscribed to water cleansing over wiping, a practice that would eventually evolve into the bidet in other parts of the world. Early versions were just streams, ponds, or any water source you could squat over. It worked, though the downstream effects on anyone fetching drinking water were, let's say, less than ideal. Now, we don't have written records from 20,000 years ago, which is probably for the best, but archaeologists have pieced together some clues from early settlements. Latrine pits, for example, tell us that even early humans recognized the benefit of keeping that stuff away from the living area. While wiping materials don't exactly fossilize well, residue analysis, a job I will personally never apply for, has revealed plant fibers, suggesting that leaves and grasses were common. In communal settings, bathroom habits were often public, not because people enjoyed it, but because privacy was a luxury. If you were part of a small hunter-gatherer band, everyone knew when you were taking a bathroom break. Subtlety wasn't really possible when you wandered off with a handful of moss. We tend to think of hygiene as an eternal human value, but that's a modern lens. In prehistory, washing yourself after a bathroom trip wasn't always a given. People bathed when they could, but not necessarily after every number two. Disease transmission from poor bathroom habits was real, but when you're living in a small, scattered group, the risks were lower than in later crowded civilizations. Plus, survival meant conserving energy, and sometimes that meant skipping the rinse cycle. Archaeological evidence from Viking-era latrines in Scandinavia suggests that everyone had intestinal parasites, because wiping with whatever's lying around isn't exactly the gold standard of sanitation. Ancient Greeks wrote satirical plays poking fun at people who were overly delicate about bathroom habits, proving that even thousands of years ago there were bathroom snobs. In tropical regions, certain large leaves became so associated with wiping that they were nicknamed after the act. Imagine naming a plant butt leaf, and everyone knowing exactly what you mean. So before the quilted luxury of modern toilet paper, bathroom life was a raw, improvisational art form. Your tools were whatever the environment offered, and your technique was as refined as your courage. Sure, the prehistoric bathroom kit lacked softness, hygiene, and convenience, but it got the job done. And when you're busy outrunning predators and gathering enough calories to survive, good enough was the gold standard. If you think today's public restrooms can be questionable, ancient Rome would like a word, though you'd probably need to bring a translator and maybe a tetanus shot. This was a civilization that mastered aqueducts, roads, and concrete, yet when it came to wiping, their solution was a stick with a sponge tied to the end. The Romans called it the tersorium, which sounds fancy until you realize it was a glorified cleaning wand for your rear end. And yes, it was a communal item. That's right, not one per person, but one per toilet row. It's the kind of sharing economy nobody asked for. The setup went something like this. You walk into a Roman public latrine, not a private little room, but an open stone bench with dozens of holes carved into it, side by side. There were no partitions, no doors, and no pretense of privacy. You'd take your seat right next to complete strangers, possibly still wearing your toga, and carry on a conversation as if you weren't both sitting over a communal trench of flowing wastewater. If you think texting in the bathroom is too casual, the Romans were exchanging political gossip while making direct eye contact. Now about that tersorium. After you did your business, you'd grab the stick and sponge combo, which may have been resting in a small gutter of water running along the floor. The cleaning process involved a quick dip into a bucket filled with vinegar or salt water, presumably to kill germs and mask the smell. Then you'd, take care of yourself. Once finished, you'd rinse it again and set it back down for the next customer. If this sounds unsanitary to you, congratulations, you are officially more hygiene conscious than the average Roman senator. In their defense, Roman engineers designed public latrines with constant water flow beneath the seats, carrying waste away to the sewers. It was, for the time, a marvel of sanitation. But that didn't stop the tersorium from being a biological nightmare. Vinegar might have done something, but given what we know about bacteria, the effectiveness of this cleaning solution was probably in the same league as rinsing your toothbrush in yesterday's coffee. Still, Romans considered it a perfectly acceptable practice. After all, when you grow up seeing everyone do it, you don't question it, much like how modern people drink milk from another species without batting an eye. The public restroom experience in Rome was more social gathering than private necessity. People came to latrines to chat, discuss politics, conduct business deals, or just escape the heat of the marketplace. Some scholars even think latrines were deliberately designed as communal spaces to reinforce social bonds. Of course, those bonds were probably strengthened further by the unspoken trust required to share a bathroom tool with your neighbor. Yes, people once shared bathroom tools in the same way you share forks at a family dinner. Badly. There were other quirks to Roman toilet culture. For one, there wasn't much gender separation in the early days. While later public baths would develop gender-specific areas, latrines could be mixed use. Imagine walking in and seeing your neighbor, your rival, and your mother-in-law all lined up on the same bench. It gave awkward silence a whole new meaning. Some wealthy Romans avoided public latrines entirely, preferring private toilets at home. But even then, the tersorium principle often applied, especially for servants or guests. For those who could afford it, fine cloth or wool might replace the sponge, and these would be washed separately, or so we hope. But the average citizen didn't have that luxury, so sponge on a stick it was. One fascinating twist is that the tersorium may not have been exclusively for wiping. Some historians argue it doubled as a kind of toilet brush to clean the seat before sitting down. This would make sense given the lack of personal ownership. The sponge could be used both before and after your turn, ensuring the seat was clear of any unfortunate leftovers from the previous user. Of course, this also meant even more cross-contamination, a fact they were blissfully unaware of. We can't be entirely sure how people felt about the tersorium. No ancient diary entries have been found where someone complains, "Dear scroll, today Publius didn't rinse the sponge properly." But given the Romans' love for satire and humor, it's possible the tersorium was the butt of many jokes, pun fully intended. It's the kind of low-hanging comedic fruit that ancient poets and playwrights wouldn't have ignored. Looking back, the tersorium tells us a lot about Roman priorities. They valued efficiency, engineering, and community interaction. But personal hygiene was a flexible concept. They believed in washing the sponge between uses, but their idea of clean was optimistic. It's a reminder that even the most advanced societies of the past still had blind spots, and in Rome's case, some of those blind spots were located exactly where you'd expect. In the grand arc of bathroom history, the Roman sponge on a stick sits at the intersection of ingenuity and obliviousness. On one hand, it was a clever, reusable solution that fit perfectly into Rome's water-based sewer system. On the other, it was an open invitation to share microbes with half the city. And yet, for hundreds of years, it worked. Or at least, it didn't kill everyone immediately. Which, in ancient times, counted as a win. Next, we could move on to the rise of early toilet paper in the Far East, where the story takes a surprisingly luxurious turn, and for once the bathroom gets an upgrade instead of a downgrade. That chapter would dive into China's invention of paper wiping, how it was reserved for the elite, and the strange etiquette rules that came with it. If the Roman sponge on a stick was a group project you couldn't opt out of, early Chinese bathroom culture was the VIP lounge of historical wiping. The Far East, particularly China, wasn't just ahead of the curve in paper making. It was ahead of the curve in realizing paper could have more uses than writing poetry or tax records. By the 6th century, Chinese inventors had already figured out how to make sheets of soft, pliable paper specifically for bathroom use, and not just scraps or recycled notes. We're talking purpose-built, don't use this for your homework kind of paper. But here's the catch. This luxury wasn't for everyone. In the early days, toilet paper was a status symbol, something you'd only find in the homes of nobles, scholars, and the imperial court. Peasants and common folk, they were still working their way through the nature's rough draft phase. For the rich, you had soft paper printed in large sheets, sometimes perfumed. For the poor, you had wood shavings, rice husks, straw or grass, each with its own texture, and none of them winning any awards for comfort. The logic for this class divide wasn't just about money, it was about labor and resources. Paper making was a skilled process involving pulping plant fibers, pressing, drying, and smoothing. It wasn't something you cranked out in your spare time between planting rice and repairing your roof. Wealthy households could commission dedicated batches of toilet paper, while the rest of society focused on, well, surviving. Historical records from the Tang dynasty show that rolls of toilet paper were produced for the imperial family by the thousands. By the 14th century, the Ming dynasty was ordering toilet paper in bulk, with some rolls measuring over 2 feet wide for the emperor's personal use. No one's entirely sure why they needed paper that wide, but let's just say it was probably better to have too much than too little when you're the son of heaven. Of course, in a culture as refined as Imperial China, wiping wasn't just a mechanical process, it came with rules. Written etiquette guides from the time spell out everything from how to position yourself to how to dispose of the used paper. One particularly detailed set of instructions warned against wiping hastily in case it caused discomfort, and stressed that paper should be folded neatly before use, because apparently even your toilet paper should have manners. Disposal was another matter of careful consideration. In urban areas, waste was collected in containers and sometimes sold as fertilizer. Yes, you could literally turn your bathroom habits into side income. The paper would eventually break down, but etiquette dictated you avoid leaving visible messes in shared facilities. In rural areas, used wiping materials might be buried or burned. The key takeaway: cleanliness wasn't just about health, it was tied to social reputation. A guest who left a mess risked more than embarrassment. They could offend their host's sense of order and decorum. Meanwhile, for the less fortunate, the bathroom experience was considerably rougher. Wood shavings, for example, were plentiful but hardly gentle. Rice husks, the papery shells left after milling rice, were common in farming communities, lightweight, absorbent, but prone to sticking in unfortunate places. Bamboo slats, thin and flexible, were sometimes used after being polished smooth, but if the craftsman had been lazy with the sanding, you'd know it instantly. Grass was another go-to material, especially in summer, though it came with seasonal risks. A stray seed or burr could make for a memorable afternoon in the worst way. Despite the gap between rich and poor, China's innovation in producing paper for hygiene eventually spread. By the late medieval period, reports from visiting merchants described entire workshops dedicated to making bathroom paper. Travelers were astonished by its quality, comparing it to silk in texture, and while they may have been exaggerating for dramatic effect, it's safe to say that China was centuries ahead of most of the world in thinking about the comfort of the bathroom experience. The cultural importance of paper in China also meant it carried symbolic weight. While common paper could be used for wiping, it was considered deeply disrespectful to use paper with writing on it, particularly if it contained characters from sacred texts or government decrees. This wasn't just a social faux pas. In some dynasties, it was an offense punishable by law. Imagine being fined because you accidentally used last week's tax notice for, well, you get the idea. Looking back, the development of toilet paper in China tells us two things. First, technological advancements don't always trickle down to everyone at the same time. The gap between wiping with perfumed paper and wiping with straw could last generations. Second, even something as mundane as bathroom habits can reflect deeper cultural values. In China, those values included cleanliness, respect for written language, and the belief that refinement should extend into every corner of life, even the smallest and most private ones. So while much of the ancient world was still figuring out how to avoid seashell injuries or negotiating whose turn it was with the communal sponge, China had already turned wiping into an art form, complete with etiquette, quality standards, and a thriving industry. The only downside? Unless you were rich, you'd still be looking longingly at that roll of paper like it was a gold ingot you could never afford. If the Chinese elite were gliding into the 14th century with perfumed toilet paper, medieval Europe was not. In fact, bathroom life between the 5th and 15th centuries was a patchwork of improvisation, questionable decisions, and the occasional moment of pure chaos. Comfort was a relative term, and cleanliness was often more an aspiration than an achievement. Whatever your social class, the medieval bathroom experience was going to test both your resourcefulness and your immune system. For the wealthy living in castles, the situation looked better on paper. Castles were equipped with garderobes, essentially small rooms built into the outer walls, where a hole led straight down to a pit or moat. The theory was that waste would drop away from the building. The reality was that wind, weather, and basic physics didn't always cooperate. If you happened to be standing in the wrong place under the garderobe chute, you might find yourself on the wrong end of medieval recycling. As for wiping, the upper classes had access to cloth scraps, wool, or even small bundles of moss brought in by servants. In some cases, linen or other fine fabrics were used, washed, and reused, a kind of luxury bidet towel service without the running water. Meanwhile, in the villages and towns, life was considerably more rustic. Common folk relied on straw, hay, or handfuls of whatever plant matter was available. Straw was abundant after harvest season, absorbent enough to do the job, and conveniently shaped for grabbing. But straw also came with splinters, dust, and sometimes bugs, which could turn a simple bathroom trip into an itchy ordeal. Hay was softer, especially when freshly cut, but it carried its own risks. You didn't just wipe in the Middle Ages, you risked starting a hay allergy mid-bathroom break. Grass, leaves, and animal fur scraps were also used, though these depended heavily on the season and the resources at hand. In urban settings, chamber pots were the great equalizer, a portable toilet for everyone from peasants to nobility. These were kept under beds or tucked in corners for convenience. The problem wasn't the pot itself, but what happened next: disposal. In many towns, the quickest method was simply to toss the contents into the street below, often with a shouted warning to pedestrians. The warning, "Garde à l'eau," watch out for the water, in France was not always given in time, leading to unfortunate encounters for anyone walking by. Rainwater would wash some of it away, but in dry weather you were left with a street that smelled like a public latrine. It wasn't exactly a postcard-worthy scene. Hygiene, in the modern sense, was not a consistent priority. Bathing varied widely depending on region, season, and personal belief. Some people bathed semi-regularly, often in public bathhouses, while others believed that water could carry disease into the body and preferred to stay dry, masking odors with perfumes or herbs. This naturally affected bathroom habits. Wiping was done to remove the obvious, not necessarily to achieve anything resembling sterility. Waste pits and cesspools were common in towns, but they often overflowed or leaked into nearby wells, which probably explains why medieval Europe had such a close relationship with dysentery. The cultural approach to wiping was also tied to superstition and tradition. In some areas, certain plants were considered unlucky to use, believed to bring bad health or misfortune. In other places, reusing cloths wasn't just practical but symbolic of thrift and order, a reflection of how every scrap of material had value. For traveling merchants or soldiers on the move, wiping materials might include old rags, leather scraps, or even handfuls of dirt when nothing else was available. Yes, dirt. As in, you'd leave the bathroom both physically and metaphorically grounded. One particularly curious medieval habit was the use of personal handkerchiefs for wiping, not the dainty embroidered kind you'd wave at a departing knight, but sturdy cloth squares kept for private use. These could be washed and reused, though washing was a relative term. Depending on the laundress and the water quality, the cloth might emerge cleaner or just wetter. This wasn't a universal practice, but in some regions it was considered perfectly respectable. The key was discretion. You didn't hang your bathroom handkerchief next to the dining linens. In monasteries and other communal living spaces, bathroom life was a regimented affair. Monks might share latrine facilities with designated wiping materials stored in baskets or hung nearby. As with many things in monastic life, there were rules for everything, including where and how you wiped. Silence was often enforced in these spaces, which probably made them less socially awkward than Roman latrines, but also more solemn than you'd want for the task at hand. For all its drawbacks, medieval Europe did see small innovations that hinted at future improvements. In some wealthier households, garderobe chutes were lined with stone or tile to reduce odor and make cleaning easier. Towns began to implement waste management ordinances, though enforcement was spotty. And the eventual spread of printed paper, though not yet dedicated toilet paper, would begin to change wiping habits in the centuries to come. Still, the defining feature of medieval bathroom life was its reliance on whatever was available at the moment. There was no standardized wiping material, no uniform etiquette, and certainly no guarantee that what you grabbed wouldn't make things worse. If you were lucky, you had fresh hay or a soft cloth. If you were unlucky, you had straw full of burrs, a chamber pot that sloshed in the wrong direction, or a garderobe that turned a breezy day into a tactical hazard. Comfort, as always, was a privilege. By the time the age of exploration rolled around, people were sailing across oceans, mapping new continents, and trading exotic goods. Yet somehow, wiping technology had barely graduated from the grab-whatever's nearby phase of human history. You could be aboard a majestic galleon with sails billowing in the wind, or settling into a newly built home in the Americas, and still be stuck with what can only be described as nature's most questionable bathroom toolkit. Let's start with the corn cob. For American settlers, it was the multi-purpose agricultural hero they never asked for. You grew corn, you ate the kernels, and then, in a move that would horrify modern sensibilities, you kept the cob for afterward. No part of the harvest was wasted, which sounds thrifty and admirable until you picture exactly how that thriftiness played out in practice. Dry corn cobs, stripped of their kernels, were firm but not too rough, a kind of rustic loofah for the pioneers' most delicate regions. They were even reusable after rinsing, a sentence no one wanted to have to write in their diary. You didn't exactly get a choice. Soft paper products simply didn't exist, so unless you were willing to sacrifice your shirt, the cob it was. And the best part, they were plentiful. If you lived in a corn-growing region, you had a year-round supply. Neighbors might borrow sugar or flour, but let's just hope the requests stopped there. The cob was practical, biodegradable, and absolutely not something you'd ever put in a gift basket unless you wanted to end the friendship. Meanwhile, at sea, sailors faced an entirely different set of bathroom challenges. On a ship, there's no cornfield just outside the door, and given the lack of privacy on board, the bathroom was little more than a strategically placed hole or head in the deck, where you hoped the ocean would take care of the rest. The waves could be unforgiving, which meant your bathroom trip was also a test of balance, courage, and your will to live. When it came to wiping, sailors got creative. Ropes were sometimes used, not just any rope, but a rope dangling over the side of the ship, trailing in the seawater. The idea was simple. You pulled it up, used it, tossed it back overboard to rinse, and prayed it wouldn't come back with sea creatures attached. Salt water, being nature's disinfectant, was considered good enough for cleaning, even if it left you feeling like you'd just accidentally sat in a brine barrel. Some ships also kept old scraps of sailcloth, or worn rags for the same purpose. Though given that sailors' hands were always covered in tar, fish guts and various forms of grime, you might question how clean those rags actually were. Of course, sailors also relied on nature itself when possible. The ocean was always right there, so why not? This method, while effective in its own cold, splashy way, did require stripping down and dangling over the side of the ship, which carried its own hazards. One wrong wave and you weren't just cleaning yourself, you were swimming home. In other parts of the world, explorers encountered wiping customs that could be surprising. For example, in some tropical areas, large leaves were used, fresh, wide, and blessedly soft compared to the settler's corn cob. In colder or drier climates, moss sometimes filled the role, providing a sort of natural cushioning. And in the Arctic, well, snow was the go-to solution. Refreshingly clean, if you could handle the temperature shock that came with it. For explorers traveling inland on horseback, tufts of animal fur from sheep, rabbits, or whatever was available could also be pressed into service, though using fur for this purpose was a sure way to ensure you didn't get invited to the next hunting trip. But wherever you went, one fact stayed the same: you used what you had. Exploration meant venturing into the unknown, which sometimes meant discovering an entirely new cuisine, and other times meant discovering an entirely new way to regret that cuisine. Local resources were a matter of survival, and your choice of bathroom tool could be the difference between a bearable day and a week-long rash. In fact, it's remarkable how adaptable humans were in this period. Settlers turned waste into tools. Sailors engineered rope-based hygiene systems. Islanders perfected the art of leaf selection. And everyone, regardless of their culture or location, came up with their own set of rules about what was acceptable. These rules weren't always universal. What was perfectly fine in one region could get you strange looks, or worse, somewhere else. If nothing else, bathroom customs were one of the earliest reminders to travelers that when in Rome, do as the Romans do, might save you from both embarrassment and infection. So while today's bathroom aisle offers a dizzying selection of plush, scented, quilted options, remember that for much of human history, the choice wasn't about 2-ply or 3-ply. It was about whether you'd rather risk splinters, salt burns, or frostbite. And if the answer was none of the above, well, you'd better invent a new solution fast. Corn cobs were so popular you'd almost think they were sold in bathroom aisles. Thankfully they weren't. By the 19th century, people in America and parts of Europe were finally becoming paper-rich, not in the "I have stocks and bonds" way, but in the "I can now wipe with yesterday's news" way. Printing presses were running full tilt, pumping out newspapers faster than gossip at a church bake sale. And for many households, the pile of discarded newsprint by the stove suddenly had a new, highly personal purpose. Toilet paper, the actual product, still existed in some form by the late 1800s, but it was expensive, fragile, and sold in rolls so small you'd swear they were manufactured by elves. Meanwhile, newspapers were big, sturdy, and most importantly free, once you were done reading them. It was the perfect storm for the printed page to become the go-to wiping material for the average person. It wasn't just thriftiness, it was practicality. Farmers, factory workers and miners couldn't justify spending money on something that literally went down the drain. But the newspaper, that was already sitting in the house, ready to serve double duty. First informing you that the mayor had opened a new bridge, then making sure your own contributions went where they belonged. The paper was thick enough to get the job done, and if you got the Sunday edition, you could practically redecorate the outhouse with an entire week's worth of newsprint. You might even choose your wiping based on the political party you disliked most, a form of petty revenge before flushing was a thing. Then came the glorious innovation of the mail-order catalogue, a true game-changer in rural America. It was thick, well-bound, and printed with hundreds of pages full of clothing, tools, household gadgets, and the occasional item you had no idea existed. But when the seasons changed and the new catalogue arrived, the old one didn't go in the trash. It went straight to the outhouse. This wasn't an accident. Sears knew its catalogue was destined for the privy. They even printed it on softer paper over time and punched a hole in the corner so it could be hung from a nail for convenient browsing, whether you were browsing for a new pair of boots or for a good square of paper. The sheer utility of the catalogue meant it often outshone actual toilet paper brands. Why buy a roll when the mailman delivered a whole book for free once or twice a year? In fact, there are stories of people writing directly to Sears requesting extra copies, not for shopping, but for sanitation purposes. The company reportedly didn't mind. After all, if a farmer flipped through the catalogue before ripping out a page, maybe he'd be inspired to order something first. It was marketing and waste management in one package, but let's not romanticize the practice. Newspapers and catalogues had a downside: ink, and not just the light smudge you get from a paperback. We're talking about industrial grade, now my hands are black and so is my other hand, kind of ink. Certain colors, especially deep blues and blacks, had a nasty habit of rubbing off on skin, leaving you with a temporary tattoo you definitely didn't want to explain to anyone. This was the era before eco-friendly soy-based inks. Many inks were made with heavy metals like lead, so while you were keeping your budget intact, you were also potentially introducing your body to a periodic microdose of poison. It was a kind of health risk they didn't put in the fine print. Still, people swore by the durability and availability of printed paper. In mining camps, sailors' quarters, prairie homesteads, and city boarding houses, it was the democratic option. Rich or poor, rural or urban, anyone could get their hands on newsprint. The added bonus: if you ran out, you could just grab the next issue hot off the press. And unlike modern toilet paper rolls, which mysteriously disappear in households with teenagers, the pile of old newspapers was rarely exhausted. There were also regional quirks. In the American South, small-town weeklies were popular for the job, and people would sometimes joke about reading ahead to see what page they'd be using later. In Canada, the Eaton's catalogue played a similar role to Sears, becoming both a shopping guide and a sanitation standby. In Australia, colonial settlers sometimes used illustrated almanacs, which meant your bathroom break could be both practical and mildly educational. By the early 20th century, the popularity of printed paper for wiping began to decline, as mass-produced toilet paper finally became affordable for the middle class. Manufacturers started selling it in rolls that were softer, easier to store, and most importantly, free from the risk of turning your backside into a Rorschach ink blot. But even well into the 1930s, there were rural families still loyal to their catalogues, not because they didn't know about store-bought toilet paper, but because they didn't see the point in paying for something Nature or Sears gave them for free. And so the age of the newspaper and catalogue as toilet paper passed into history, living on mostly as a quirky footnote in the story of human hygiene. But in its time it was more than just a budget solution. It was a cultural moment, proof that humans have always been resourceful, especially when it comes to life's least glamorous necessities. As the old saying might have gone, nothing says luxury like yesterday's headlines on your behind. If there's one thing human history proves, it's that we can go millennia without inventing some of the world's greatest comforts, and then once we do, we start overcomplicating them immediately. Toilet paper's modern chapter begins in 1857 with one Joseph Gayety, an American entrepreneur who looked at the piles of newspapers, corn cobs, and improvised cleaning devices of the day and thought, we can do better than this. Gayety's creation was medicated paper. Sheets of manila hemp treated with aloe, meant to prevent hemorrhoids and other afflictions of the fundament. Victorian-era marketing was a poetry of its own, sold in flat sheets. Each one proudly bore his name, because nothing says dignity like having a stranger's signature on your backside. Now, Gayety's paper was technically the first commercial toilet paper, but it wasn't an instant hit. Why? Well, for one thing, people were used to free wiping materials, junk mail, corn cobs, or whatever was handy, so asking them to pay for something they literally flushed away was a hard sell. For another, his sheets came in boxes, not rolls, so there was no easy tearing or convenient wall mount. And finally, there was the small fact that many people at the time still viewed the bathroom as a topic so impolite it barely existed in conversation. You could talk about your new hat or your prized cow, but heaven forbid you bring up wiping materials over dinner. The real revolution came when someone took Gayety's idea and rolled with it, literally. The exact origin of perforated rolls is a bit messy, but the most famous claim comes from the Albany Perforated Wrapping Paper Company in the late 19th century. Their idea was beautifully simple. Wrap sheets of paper around a cardboard tube, add perforations so you could tear off the perfect amount, and sell it in a form that was both practical and discreet. No more loose sheets lying around like you'd just hosted a failed origami party. Of course, early rolls weren't soft. In fact, they were closer to sandpaper than the ultra-soft triple-ply with lotion we know today. Some people even joked that wiping with them was just a faster way of exfoliating. Still, the convenience factor won people over, and once the roll became standard, companies began competing to improve comfort. Perforations were refined, paper got smoother, and marketing departments went into overdrive trying to convince the public that their brand was the pinnacle of personal hygiene. Branding was everything. By the early 20th century, names like Charmin and Northern started appearing, each promising comfort and luxury in the most discreet way possible. Charmin, for example, leaned into its soft and squeezable image, even running ads featuring women delicately handling the product, because apparently the best way to sell bathroom paper was to make it look like an expensive silk scarf. Meanwhile, Northern emphasized its sanitary qualities, using the word so often you'd think competitors were selling rolls dipped in dirt. Perforation technology also improved dramatically. The early tier here lines were hit or miss, often more miss, leading to ragged edges and awkward moments when you accidentally pulled off half the roll. Later machines cut clean, even sheets, a small but vital innovation in ensuring no one used more than they needed, which, in a household of many, could be a cause for full-scale domestic conflict. Another big shift was how toilet paper was packaged and displayed. Before, people might hide their wiping materials away in a cabinet or a box, but as brands emphasized hygiene and elegance, rolls started being proudly displayed in bathrooms. This was partly clever marketing, and partly a sign that society was getting more comfortable talking, if still obliquely, about its bathroom habits. You could buy a decorative holder, match your roll to your bathroom decor, and yes, even hang it in such a way that it sparked endless over or under debates. Gaty might not have lived to see just how massive his idea became, but he'd probably be astonished to know that by the mid-20th century, toilet paper wasn't just a convenience, it was a cultural necessity. In fact, in times of crisis, it became one of the first things people panic bought, proving that no matter how advanced humanity gets, some instincts are eternal. The birth of the modern roll wasn't just about paper, it was about turning a universal human need into a refined, marketable product. From boxes of aloe-treated sheets to perforated rolls on shiny holders, it marked the moment wiping left the realm of improvisation and entered the age of innovation. Finally, there was a product you could proudly display in your bathroom and not hide under the sink next to the plunger. In the modern bathroom, toilet paper is no longer just a humble hygiene product. It's a lifestyle choice, a status symbol, and in some cases an art form that makes you wonder if humanity has run out of real problems. Gone are the days when you had two options, rough or slightly less rough. Now the shelves of any well-stocked supermarket boast a dizzying array of rolls promising cloud-like softness, aloe-infused comfort, lavender scents, embossed patterns and ply counts so high they could double as insulation for your home. Somewhere out there, someone is even buying 22-karat gold leaf toilet paper, not because it's practical, but because they have both too much money and a questionable sense of priorities. Luxury branding has taken TP into territory its humble inventors never imagined. You can get rolls wrapped individually in decorative paper, boutique bamboo toilet tissue that claims to be ethical, and ultra-thick quilted designs that feel like you're wiping with a bathrobe. And if you think this sounds excessive, just remember, somewhere in the world there's a toilet paper subscription service delivering artisanal rolls to people's doorsteps. Yes, the same human race that once used moss now receives monthly shipments of color-coordinated bathroom tissue. But despite all this innovation, the world isn't unified in its approach to cleaning up. In North America, the toilet paper roll reigns supreme, a staple so culturally ingrained that suggesting an alternative can cause genuine outrage. Meanwhile, in much of Europe, the Middle East and Asia, bidets are the preferred option. To some, they're a marvel of hygiene and water efficiency. To others, they're an overly complicated garden hose for the bathroom. The cultural divide is so strong that international travelers often find themselves baffled. Americans visiting Japan discover heated, music-playing bidet toilets that feel more like sitting in a luxury car than a restroom. Europeans visiting the US, 1. On the other hand, Wonder why Americans keep a paper mill in their bathroom but can't seem to produce a decent espresso. And then came 2020, the year that tested humanity's priorities in the strangest way possible. When the pandemic hit, fear and uncertainty spread faster than the virus itself, and in grocery stores worldwide, an unexpected product became the symbol of security: toilet paper. Shelves emptied overnight as people filled carts with enough rolls to last until the next century. Social media exploded with photos of stockpiles, and black market TP deals reportedly happened in parking lots. If aliens had landed during March 2020, they would have assumed this mysterious toilet paper was our global currency, and honestly, they wouldn't have been wrong. Why the hoarding? Psychologists suggest it was partly about control. In an unpredictable crisis, people latch onto tangible things they can manage. You can't stop a pandemic, but you can make absolutely sure you won't be stuck using a kitchen towel in the bathroom. Plus, toilet paper takes up a lot of space in carts, giving the comforting illusion of abundance a subconscious "look how prepared I am" statement. Retailers scrambled to keep up, imposing purchase limits and assuring customers there was no actual shortage, just an imbalance caused by panic buying. But the psychological shift had already happened. Suddenly, toilet paper was precious. People posted memes about guarding their stash like gold bars. Couples joked about including TP in their wills, and a few clever entrepreneurs sold novelty rolls online for absurd markups. As the world adapted, the shelves slowly refilled, but the great toilet paper shortage of 2020 left its mark. It reminded us that even in the age of smartphones, space travel and AI, our most primal fears can still be triggered by the thought of running out of something as simple as a roll of paper. Today, the toilet paper industry is stronger than ever, still innovating in both luxury and sustainability. Companies are experimenting with recycled materials, bamboo fiber, and zero plastic packaging. Others are doubling down on extravagance, offering patterned, scented, and themed rolls for every holiday. The cultural debate over bidets versus rolls continues. But one thing is clear: whatever the future of wiping looks like, humans will keep finding ways to make it softer, cleaner, and occasionally unnecessarily glamorous. And so, from Joseph Gaetti's aloe-treated sheets to the 24-karat novelty rolls of today, the story of toilet paper is a perfect reflection of human nature. Resourceful, inventive, sometimes ridiculous, and always very, very concerned with comfort. After all, some luxuries are too personal to compromise. Alexander Fleming entered the world on August 6, 1881, in the damp and rugged landscape of Ayrshire, Scotland. If you're picturing rolling green hills dotted with sheep, you're spot on, except you'd also need to add some stubborn cows, muddy boots, and the kind of persistent drizzle that could make you question the existence of the sun. His parents, Hugh and Grace Fleming, ran a modest farm in Lockfield, which meant young Alex's early education included lessons in milking, feeding animals, and learning how to stay upright in knee-deep muck. It wasn't exactly the birthplace you'd imagine for a man destined to save millions of lives. At the time, rural Scotland wasn't known for producing groundbreaking scientists. It was known for producing tough, practical people who could wrestle with a bale of hay and win. But Fleming had something extra: an eye for detail and a curiosity about how things worked. He'd watch streams carry tiny specks of life, notice patterns in the way plants grew, and in the way of all sharp-eyed children, ask questions adults didn't always have time to answer. His father died when Alexander was just 7, leaving Grace to raise 4 children from Hugh's first marriage and 4 from her own. If there was ever a crash course in resilience, this was it. Fleming learned early that if something needed doing, you didn't wait for someone else to do it. A skill that would serve him well in the chaotic world of scientific research. Fleming's schooling began at a small local school, the sort of place where the science lab was more of a theoretical concept than an actual room. Still, he excelled at his studies, showing a knack for both precision and patience. At the age of 13, he moved to Kilmarnock Academy, a step up from his village school, before eventually making his way to London in 18. This was a huge leap, going from the windswept fields of Ayrshire to the bustling heart of the British Empire was like stepping into another universe. London in the late 19th century was a place of dizzying contrasts, glittering wealth next to grinding poverty, cutting-edge science alongside deeply questionable medicine, and the unmistakable smell of horse manure on every street. Fleming initially joined his elder brother Tom, a physician, which gave him his first brush with the medical world. But Alexander's first career wasn't in medicine, it was in shipping. He took a job as a clerk in a shipping office, which may sound respectable, but for a curious young man, it was about as thrilling as watching paint dry. Fortunately, fate, and possibly boredom, intervened. Fleming inherited some money after an uncle passed away, which gave him the freedom to consider a career change. Around this time he also joined the London Scottish Rifle Volunteers, an experience that made him physically tough and comfortable with discipline. The army might not seem directly connected to medical breakthroughs, but it would later feed into his understanding of wounds, infection, and the urgent need for better treatments. In 1901, Fleming enrolled at St Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. At first his interest leaned towards surgery, which at the time was a somewhat terrifying discipline involving more saws than antibiotics. But one of his professors spotted his extraordinary talent for research and persuaded him to join the bacteriology department. This was a pivotal moment. Surgery might have given him an exciting career, but bacteriology was where he'd make history. The St Mary's labs were a mix of intellectual rigor and practical problem-solving. Here, Fleming thrived. He was meticulous with his experiments, methodical with his observations, and though he might not have known it then, just the kind of man who could recognize something unusual growing in a petri dish and think, that's interesting, rather than I should probably clean that up. What set Fleming apart even in these early years was his combination of precision and unconventional thinking. While other students memorized facts and followed instructions to the letter, Fleming was more interested in asking, why does this work the way it does? He wasn't rebellious for rebellion's sake. He simply understood that innovation often came from looking where no one else bothered to look. London gave him access to leading medical minds of the time, but it also exposed him to the realities of disease. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other infections were common, and medicine's best tools for treating them were often crude, sometimes harmful, and frequently ineffective. For a man who had seen firsthand the importance of fighting infections, even before his wartime service, this was both frustrating and motivating. By the time Fleming completed his studies, he was no longer the farm boy from Lockfield, though he retained the practicality and quiet determination that upbringing had instilled in him. He had become a fully qualified doctor, a researcher with a growing interest in bacteriology, and unknowingly, a man standing on the edge of one of the most important discoveries in medical history. And yet, in these early days, there was no hint of global fame or Nobel Prizes. He was simply Dr. Buchan, Alexander Fleming, a quiet man in a white coat, peering into microscopes and growing colonies of bacteria on agar plates. The world-changing moment was still years away, hiding in the future like a mold spore, waiting for the right conditions to flourish. He started life milking cows. Later he'd milk mold for all it was worth. If you want to understand why Alexander Fleming became the man who accidentally changed medicine forever, you have to drop him straight into the blood, mud, and misery of the First World War. Forget the cozy image of the lab-coated scientist humming over petri dishes. Before that came the trenches, where the smell of rotting flesh and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. In 1914, Fleming was no stranger to hard work. He'd survived a Scottish farm childhood and the rigorous halls of medical school, but nothing prepared him for the Western Front. When war broke out, he enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps, swapping the sterile tiles of St Mary's Hospital for field dressing stations in France. There, his job was to keep wounded soldiers alive long enough for them to have a fighting chance at recovery. Spoiler, that was much harder than anyone wanted to admit. The weapon that killed most soldiers wasn't always a bullet, it was bacteria. Sure, a gunshot to the chest was fatal enough, but even something as minor as a shrapnel wound to the arm could turn into a death sentence. Why? because a battlefield was essentially a giant petri dish from hell: mud, manure, unwashed uniforms, and the occasional decomposing horse, all stirred together into a bacterial stew. When shrapnel ripped through flesh, it didn't just cut, it carried whatever delightful microbes were on it straight inside. Within hours, the wound could puff up like bread dough, oozing pus, smelling like something you wouldn't even feed to the enemy, and leaving soldiers with a fever that climbed fast. The problem wasn't just the bacteria themselves, it was that there wasn't much to fight them with. Antiseptics existed, sure, things like carbolic acid, iodine and hydrogen peroxide, but they were often as destructive to the patient as they were to the infection. Doctors were essentially gambling: kill the germs and risk killing the surrounding tissue, or leave the wound alone and hope for the best. In many cases, the best meant amputation. Fleming saw this cycle day after day. A soldier would be brought in, arm shredded, dirt embedded deep in the wound. The medics would clean it as best they could, pour on antiseptics, and bandage it. Sometimes it worked, more often it didn't. Fleming noticed that antiseptics, especially when applied to deep wounds, often failed to stop infection, and worse, destroyed the body's natural defenses, white blood cells included. In other words, the very thing they were using to save lives could be making things worse. To put it bluntly, the war forced Fleming into a crash course in the limitations of medicine. He wasn't a man who liked losing, and watching soldiers die of pus-filled wounds left him more than frustrated, it left him obsessed. He began experimenting on bacteria right there in the field, testing how different antiseptics worked, and more importantly, when they didn't. While other medics might have shrugged and called it the cost of war, Fleming quietly filed away the idea that there had to be a better way. If you're picturing him as a kind of battlefield Sherlock Holmes for germs, you're not far off. He didn't just accept what medical manuals said, he poked at the problem, studied the evidence, and came to his own conclusions. One of his most important realizations during this time was that bacteria weren't the passive, easily slaughtered organisms doctors like to imagine. They were resilient, adaptive, and downright sneaky. Kill most of them, and the survivors came back stronger. In hindsight, this was the early glimmer of what we now call antibiotic resistance. Of course, Fleming didn't have antibiotics yet. No one did. But the war planted the seed in his mind that the best cure for infection wouldn't come from simply burning everything in sight with chemicals. It would have to come from something that could kill bacteria without harming the body's own cells. He didn't know it yet, but this line of thinking was what would make him so receptive, years later, to the strange little mold that wandered into his lab. The trenches also taught him a different kind of lesson. Timing was everything. If an infection was caught early and the wound kept clean, survival rates shot up. But once bacteria got a foothold, the body could lose the fight fast. This urgency, the ticking clock of infection, would shape the way he approached medical research in peacetime. And let's not underestimate the personal impact. Fleming wasn't a dramatic man, but he wasn't made of stone either. Imagine seeing hundreds of young men barely out of school, cut down not just by enemy fire but by microbes too small to see. Imagine knowing that in many cases their deaths might have been preventable with the right treatment. That sticks with you. It stuck with him. The war ended in 1918, and Fleming went back to St. Mary's, outwardly resuming his quiet life as a researcher. But the battlefields never really left him. In the lab, every petri dish he studied, every culture he grew, was part of a bigger picture, finding a way to win the fight against infection without turning the patient into collateral damage. Well, you could say this. Nothing motivates a scientist like watching soldiers lose a fight to pus. Guns, grenades, and gas masks might win wars, but in Fleming's mind the real victory would be figuring out how to make sure no one died because a wound went septic. And that was a war worth fighting. Alexander Fleming's laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital was not so much a workspace as it was a three-dimensional case study in entropy. Imagine a room where every surface was occupied by some mysterious stain, beaker, or scrap of paper covered in handwriting only the author could possibly decipher if he squinted hard enough. To the untrained eye, It looked like the set for a crime drama about a serial clutterer. To Fleming, however, it was a system, and as every self-respecting messy person will tell you, there was a system, you just wouldn't understand it. This chaos was not an accident of personality alone. Fleming was a man constantly juggling multiple lines of inquiry. His work involved cultivating bacteria, testing new substances against them, and importantly, never throwing anything away just in case it proved useful later. In an age before high-tech refrigeration and automated tracking systems, this meant that his bench was often stacked with petri dishes, glass tubes, and oddly shaped colonies of something growing quietly in the corners. It was less sterile scientific precision and more Victorian greenhouse, but for germs. In 1928, Fleming's life was chugging along in this controlled chaos. His main work at the time involved studying Staphylococcus bacteria, those pus-producing troublemakers that seem to delight in causing infections. He had dozens of culture plates on the go, each one with its own little bacterial metropolis thriving in gelatinous agar. Normally he'd inspect them, record observations, and dispose of the old ones once the experiment's concluded. But here's where the plot thickens, or rather, where the agar gets fluffy. Late in the summer, Fleming decided to take a holiday. This wasn't unusual. London summers could be stuffy, and even the most dedicated scientist needed a break. But his departure was less of a carefully shut down the lab affair, and more of a casually wander out the door while humming a tune, leaving science to fend for itself situation. He stacked his petri dishes in a corner of the bench, perhaps thinking he'd deal with them later, and left. When he returned in early September, the lab was just as he'd left it, except for one curious plate. Among the small golden colonies of Staphylococcus on the agar was an interloper, a fuzzy patch of bluish-green mold. This in itself wasn't shocking. Contamination happened all the time, especially in a lab where open dishes and airborne spores could mingle like guests at a particularly unhygienic cocktail party. But here was the odd thing. Around the mold, the bacteria weren't just absent, they were obliterated. The clear, glassy halo around the mold looked as though it had been scrubbed clean, a no-bacteria zone in the middle of an otherwise thriving bacterial city. The mold had somehow waged a microscopic war and won. Now this is where the difference between a sloppy scientist and a genius with a good eye becomes important. A less observant person might have tossed the plate into the waste bin with a sigh about ruined experiments, but Fleming leaned in, curious. He didn't see a failure, he saw an opportunity. What was this mold? Why had it murdered his Staphylococcus so effectively? Through testing, Fleming identified the mold as Penicillium notatum. This wasn't exactly a stranger to science. Botanists and mycologists had catalogued it before, but its bacterial killing properties weren't well understood. Fleming began tinkering with it, transferring the mold's juice to other bacterial cultures and noting the results. Again and again, the substance proved lethal to many harmful bacteria, while leaving human cells unharmed. The fact that this discovery happened because Fleming's lab resembled a cross between a compost heap and a library sale table is one of history's favorite ironies. His messiness wasn't deliberate in a genius-at-work PR sense, it was simply how he operated. But it meant that rather than sterilizing everything within seconds of contamination, he allowed strange accidents to sit long enough to reveal something interesting. That said, the real story here isn't just about mess. It's about scientific curiosity and the willingness to investigate the unexpected. Plenty of scientists encounter accidents. Fewer have the instinct to realize the accident might be more important than the experiment they were trying to run in the first place. Fleming didn't just clean up the mess and move on. He pivoted, reoriented his focus and began testing what the mold could do. And here's the delightful irony. If Fleming had been the kind of man who cleaned his lab before vacation, the petri dish in question would never have survived. The mold would have been swabbed away, and penicillin might have taken years or decades longer to be discovered. Of course, at this stage, Fleming didn't yet have a miracle drug in hand. The mold's antibacterial juice worked in the lab, but it was unstable, hard to purify, and reluctant to perform on a large scale. The leap from fuzzy green patch to life-saving medicine would require years of work by other scientists, but this was the spark, and it was lit not in a moment of careful planning, but in the delightful, improbable intersection of human inattention and nature's creativity. His cleaning habits were questionable, but they saved the world. Try telling your parents that next time they yell about your room. If you've ever stumbled across a green fuzz colony in the back of your fridge, you've probably tossed it in the trash without ceremony. Alexander Fleming, however, decided to give his mold a name and a future. In late 1928, after his messy lab vacation miracle, Fleming set about figuring out exactly what this uninvited houseguest was. Through a mix of microscope work, spore sampling, and microbiology detective work, he identified the culprit as Penicillium notatum, a rather ordinary-looking mold with an extraordinarily lethal effect on bacteria. Now, penicillium doesn't exactly sound like something you'd put in a heroic headline. It sounds more like an Italian bakery chain. But the name penicillin, which Fleming derived from the Latin penicillus, meaning paintbrush, referring to the mold's shape, at least rolled off the tongue a little easier. Imagine if he'd gone with fungal juice or petri dish surprise. Medical history might have been a lot less inspiring. Fleming was no stranger to making bacterial enemies, but now he had a potential bacterial assassin on his side. He noticed that this mold secreted a substance that could dissolve certain bacteria entirely, most notably Staphylococcus, which was behind many infections that, in the 1920s, could turn a paper cut into a death sentence. Under the microscope, it was like watching a microscopic crime scene, bacteria thriving one moment, melting into nothing the next. And yet, in a twist that would frustrate him for years, almost no one cared. This was partly because the 1920s scientific community had been burned before. Miracle cures had been announced in the past. Tonics, serums, elixirs that either didn't work or worked only if you ignored inconvenient patient deaths. So when Fleming presented his findings in 1929 to the British Journal of Experimental Pathology, the reaction was tepid. The problem wasn't just skepticism, it was that penicillin was tricky to work with. The active ingredient was delicate, degrading quickly outside the mold, and difficult to isolate in a usable form. Fleming's initial experiments proved its bacteria-killing potential, but also showed that it broke down in the human body too fast to be practical, at least with the methods he had. Scientists nodded politely at his papers, filed them under interesting but impractical, and went back to whatever they were working on. Another obstacle: money. Fleming didn't have the funds or the industrial connections to scale up penicillin production. Pharmaceutical companies in the early 20th century were not exactly throwing investment at mysterious mold juice with no obvious profit plan. Besides, sulfur drugs, the reigning antibacterial treatments of the day, were already dominating the market despite their side effects. Penicillin was like an indie band with no record deal, critically interesting but commercially invisible. Adding to his uphill battle, Fleming was not a showman. He lacked the razzle-dazzle personality of a scientist who could captivate investors or charm journalists. He was methodical, soft-spoken, and prone to understatement, the kind of man who would describe discovering the future of medicine as a rather interesting observation. In other words, not the type to kick down the door of the Royal Society and shout, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've found the cure for death." So the mold sat in relative obscurity. Fleming kept tinkering, publishing occasional updates, and storing cultures of Penicillium notatum in his lab like a strange green insurance policy. He never abandoned the idea entirely, but without collaborators who could solve the manufacturing puzzle, his breakthrough hovered on the edge of irrelevance. Meanwhile, the bacterial world kept winning. Infections still claimed countless lives, especially in hospitals, where surgeries and childbirth carried terrifying risks. Fleming knew he was sitting on something that could change the game, but convincing others was like trying to sell fire insurance to a crowd who insisted their houses were fireproof. In a strange way, Fleming's mold problem was less about science and more about marketing. Penicillin needed someone or several someones who could hype it, refine it, and turn it into an actual treatment. For now, the scientific community's verdict was essentially neat mold. Anyway, it was a frustrating chapter in the penicillin saga, but also a reminder of how discoveries aren't just about the eureka moment, they're about the long, boring, often humiliating slog afterward. And in 1929, Fleming's cool mold bro moment seemed destined to remain a footnote in microbiology textbooks. Little did anyone realize that the world was only a decade away from a war that would turn his forgotten petri dish into the most valuable petri dish in human history. The scientific community shrugged and said, "Cool mold, bro." Fleming kept it anyway, proving that sometimes the thing growing in your fridge might just be worth holding on to, assuming it's not trying to eat the fridge. By the early 1930s, Alexander Fleming had what every scientist dreams of, a discovery that could change the course of human health. The problem was, he also had something every chef fears, a recipe that works beautifully in tiny portions but collapses when you try to make a full batch. Fleming could coax Penicillium notatum into growing in shallow dishes, producing its magical bacteria-killing liquid, but the yield was minuscule. We're talking a few teaspoons at a time, enough to treat a paper cut maybe, but useless for a serious infection. His process was crude and messy. Step 1. Grow the mold in a nutrient broth until it looked like a swamp in miniature. Step 2. Filter out the mold, leaving behind the slightly golden mold juice. Step 3. Hope it hadn't already broken down by the time you tried to use it. Unfortunately, penicillin was notoriously unstable. The active compound would degrade in the presence of heat, light, or even a bad mood, making it impossible to store for long periods. You couldn't ship it across town, let alone across the country. Worse, the equipment he had was laughably unsuited for industrial production. Fleming's penicillin factory was essentially a collection of shallow glass trays in a lab, each holding a few millimeters of liquid. He would later admit that producing enough penicillin to treat a single serious infection would have required hundreds of dishes, a sort of mold-based assembly line that would have driven even the most patient technician mad. Imagine trying to fill swimming pools with teaspoons. Then there was the extraction process. Fleming didn't have the chemical know-how to isolate pure penicillin from the broth in which it grew. His early attempts produced solutions that were too weak to be used in patients. The concentration was so low that even if you injected it, the drug would be destroyed by the body's enzymes before it could put much of a dent in an infection. In short, Fleming had stumbled upon a miracle substance, but it was locked inside a fragile, watery prison. He did what scientists do. He published more papers, gave more talks, and hoped someone with better resources might take an interest. But medical research in the 1930s was a competitive landscape, and penicillin's fragility made it a tough sell. Pharmaceutical companies preferred projects with predictable yields and long shelf lives. Sulfur drugs, the reigning antibacterial champions, could be manufactured in big batches, stored for months, and distributed widely. Compared to that, Fleming's mold juice looked like a high-maintenance diva, so penicillin languished. It didn't disappear entirely. Fleming kept a few cultures alive in his lab, sharing them occasionally with curious colleagues, but the momentum stalled. The medical world moved on to other, shinier research. The reality was brutal. Revolutionary ideas can wither not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient. This was the point at which penicillin nearly became one of history's great what-ifs. Science is littered with such stories, promising leads that were abandoned for decades because no one could crack the production puzzle. If the right team hadn't eventually picked it up, Fleming's mold might have ended up as a quirky footnote in microbiology textbooks. In 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist discovered a bacteria-killing mold. It didn't work out. Moving on, Fleming's frustration was obvious in his notes. He'd observed penicillin's ability to save lives in theory, but he couldn't scale it beyond the petri dish. He compared it to trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. Even if he'd wanted to treat patients, he would have been forced to choose between them like some grim medical lottery. Congratulations, sir. Your infection is the lucky winner of our only usable dose this month. To make matters worse, the early 1930s were not exactly awash in research funding. The Great Depression had tightened purse strings everywhere, and pouring money into a delicate, untested drug was low on most governments' priority lists. This was an era when science had to fight for every shilling, and Fleming didn't have the charisma or institutional clout to make penicillin the hot new project. And so, the mold waited. It's strange to think of a life-saving medicine just sitting there, growing quietly in a laboratory, ignored, while people died from infections it could have stopped. But that's exactly what happened for almost a decade. The only thing keeping penicillin alive was Fleming's stubbornness. He didn't have the means to turn it into a usable drug, but he refused to let it vanish entirely. He'd basically invented a miracle, but it came in teaspoon batches, the medical equivalent of discovering gold dust, but having only a straw to collect it. By the end of the decade, the world had bigger problems looming. Political tensions in Europe were boiling toward another global war, and no one realized that those green-speckled lab trays at St. Mary's Hospital might one day play a starring role in it. In another timeline, the outbreak of World War II would have buried penicillin forever under the rubble of forgotten projects. But history, as it turns out, had other plans. When Alexander Fleming first stumbled upon the antibacterial magic of Penicillium notatum, he had no idea that the real breakthrough would come almost a decade later, not in his own cluttered lab but in a very different one at Oxford University. By the late 1930s, the mold's potential was still buried under layers of technical impossibility and public indifference. Fleming had shown it worked, but he couldn't show it worked enough. Producing penicillin was like squeezing juice from a raisin, painstaking, slow, and utterly inadequate for anyone trying to treat more than a single patient at a time. Enter a team of scientists who luckily were more than ready to wrestle with impossible problems: Howard Florey, Ernst Boris Chain, and Norman Heatley. Florey was the ringleader, an Australian pathologist with a talent for both organizing large projects and knowing which bright minds to bring together. He was methodical, no nonsense, and possessed the rare skill of being able to talk both to chemists and to bureaucrats without losing his patience. Chain, a German-born biochemist, brought the deep chemical expertise needed to figure out why this mold worked and how it could be extracted in a more useful form. And then there was Heatley, the youngest of the trio, a biochemist and engineer who could take a wildly impractical lab concept and turn it into something that might actually work in the real world. Their meeting of minds happened at a moment when the world desperately needed a medical miracle. The late 1930s were not exactly a time for leisurely scientific curiosity. The world was sliding toward war, and in wartime wounds weren't the only killers. Infections lurked behind every injury, ready to finish the job. Bullets and shrapnel had started. The British government, while cautious about allocating funds, knew that an effective antibacterial drug could save thousands of lives. It was the perfect storm of necessity meeting opportunity, and the Oxford team intended to seize it. The first hurdle: figuring out how to produce enough penicillin to actually test it. Fleming's methods produced only minuscule amounts, enough to prove a point under a microscope, but not enough to treat even a single patient. Florey, Chain, and Heatley decided that scaling up production was a chemistry and engineering problem, not just a microbiology one. They converted parts of the Dunn School of Pathology into a Frankenstein's kitchen, cobbling together equipment from whatever they could find: milk churns, ceramic bedpans, old biscuit tins. If it could hold liquid and wasn't already in use by the janitor, it was fair game for penicillin brewing. Heatley, in particular, became the mastermind of this makeshift production line. He designed special vessels that allowed the penicillium mold to grow in a way that maximized output. He adjusted the nutrient mixtures, fiddled with temperatures, and even tinkered with airflow. It was, in many ways, less like modern pharmaceutical manufacturing and more like artisanal brewing if your craft beer could also stop gangrene in its tracks. By 1940, they had enough penicillin to begin animal trials. The results were nothing short of astonishing. Mice infected with lethal doses of bacteria survived when given penicillin, while their untreated counterparts did not. It was one of those rare before and after moments in medical history. Undeniable proof that this wasn't just a scientific curiosity, but a genuine lifesaver. Encouraged, they cautiously moved to human trials. The first was a policeman named Albert Alexander, who had developed a severe, life-threatening infection from a small scratch. He received penicillin and showed a dramatic improvement within days. The bad news: the Oxford team didn't have enough penicillin to finish the treatment, and the infection eventually returned, killing him. It was a tragic loss, but also undeniable proof that if only they could make more, penicillin could change everything. This urgency collided head-on with the realities of wartime Britain. Resources were scarce, and the government had to decide what projects deserved priority. Fortunately for the Oxford team, the looming casualty lists of World War II made their case stronger than any sales pitch. If penicillin could keep soldiers alive after injury, it wasn't just a medical tool, it was a military advantage. From there, the project shifted into overdrive. American pharmaceutical companies, with their bigger budgets, industrial know-how, and enormous fermentation facilities, were brought into the picture. Heatley even traveled to the United States to share their methods and get large-scale production going. By 1944, penicillin was available in quantities large enough to treat thousands of soldiers during the D-Day invasion. And that's when penicillin truly went from "we can treat one paper cut" to "we can treat an army" in record time. It's difficult to overstate the leap. Just a few years earlier, a single dose was precious enough to recycle from a patient's urine. Yes, you read that right. It was literally recovered and reused. Now, they were producing it by the gallon. Fleming may have discovered penicillin, but it was the Oxford team who turned it into a practical, world-changing weapon against disease. Without Florey's leadership, Chain's biochemical expertise, and Heatley's engineering genius, the mold in Fleming's lab might have been just another forgotten oddity in a dusty petri dish. Instead, it became the most important drug of the 20th century, and arguably the one that saved the most lives in human history. It really did go from treating a single scratch to treating an entire military force, and while the Oxford Boys sounds like the name of a ragtag football club, in reality, they were the team that proved mold could win a war. When penicillin finally made its debut on the global stage in the early 1940s, it didn't just change medicine, it rewrote the survival odds of humanity. Before its arrival, infections were like ruthless, invisible executioners. A scraped knee could become a death sentence. A routine surgery could be the beginning of a slow farewell, and giving birth came with the constant gamble that an infection could turn celebration into tragedy. Suddenly, with penicillin, these everyday threats lost much of their bite. The world didn't just breathe a sigh of relief, it practically took a deep, giddy gasp. By the time World War II was in full swing, penicillin had proven itself as the ultimate ally in keeping soldiers alive. Wounds that once spelt certain death were now treatable. The transformation was staggering. Field hospitals that used to brace for gangrene and sepsis were now seeing soldiers return to duty. Death rates from infected battle wounds dropped dramatically, and this miracle drug followed troops from Europe to the Pacific, packed into medical kits like the world's most valuable rations. But its influence went far beyond the battlefield. Back home, civilians benefited just as much. Penicillin quickly became the go-to weapon against everything from pneumonia to scarlet fever. Before penicillin, pneumonia alone claimed tens of thousands of lives each year in the United States. Within a decade of its introduction, those numbers plummeted. It was like humanity had been fighting bacterial infections bare-handed for centuries, and finally someone handed them a sword. The magnitude of this breakthrough didn't go unnoticed by the Nobel Committee. In 1945, Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Boris Chain were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work on penicillin. It was a rare moment when the world actually paused to give credit to scientists instead of inventors of the year's most exciting toaster. The trio stood side by side in Stockholm, smiling politely for photographs and giving speeches that would be replayed endlessly in the press. Yet, if you asked the average person who discovered penicillin, they'd probably say Alexander Fleming without hesitation. The media loved the romantic tale of a lone scientist stumbling upon a petri dish miracle. It was cleaner, simpler, and frankly more cinematic than the truth. Messy lab plus mold equals miracle is a headline that practically writes itself. The reality that a whole team of researchers had to wrestle penicillin into a usable, mass-producible form wasn't as easy to fit into a news column. Fleming himself wasn't entirely comfortable with the solo hero narrative. He regularly acknowledged that without Florey, Chain, and Norman Heatley, penicillin might have remained nothing more than an interesting laboratory footnote. But humility isn't always contagious, and the public clung to their version of the story. Fleming's name became shorthand for life-saving genius, while his colleagues often got the quieter footnotes in history books. It was like giving the Oscar for Best Picture to the guy who came up with the movie's title. Still, all three Nobel winners used their newfound fame to champion the importance of medical research. Fleming, in particular, issued an early and eerily prophetic warning. Bacteria could eventually become resistant to penicillin if it was overused or misused. In his Nobel lecture, he essentially predicted the antibiotic resistance crisis we face today, telling the audience that careless dosing could lead to the death of penicillin. At the time, his warning was brushed off by many as overly cautious. After all, who could imagine a world where this miracle drug would stop working? Spoiler, Fleming could. As penicillin production ramped up after the war, its effects rippled outward. It inspired the search for other antibiotics, streptomycin, tetracycline, and many more, creating what historians now call the golden age of antibiotics. Diseases that had haunted humanity for centuries were suddenly manageable. People who would have been buried in their 20s now lived to complain about their hip replacements in their 80s. It was one of those rare moments in history when the curve of human survival made a sharp, undeniable upward turn. But with every miracle comes its mythology. The story of penicillin became a kind of scientific fairy tale. A humble farm boy grows up to be a scientist, discovers a life-saving mold, and wins the Nobel Prize. The actual reality was messier, full of wartime urgency, collaborative research, industrial scaling challenges, and a lot of trial and error. But sometimes the world needs its fairy tales, especially when the ending really is, and millions lived happily ever after. The truth is, penicillin didn't just save lives, it changed how people thought about medicine itself. Before its arrival, humanity had been in a centuries-long war with bacteria and was losing badly. Penicillin turned the tide, and in doing so, it gave people a dangerous sense of invincibility. If we could beat infections this easily, what else could science conquer? That optimism, tempered later by the reality of resistance, helped fuel decades of medical innovation, and so the credit roll began. Fleming was splashed across magazine covers and children's textbooks. Florey and Chain got their share of honors, though less spotlight. Heatley, who solved the problem of extracting penicillin in usable amounts, was mostly forgotten outside of specialist circles. The history of penicillin became a reminder of how science is rarely the work of one person, even if the movie poster says otherwise. It turns out saving humanity is a group project, but Fleming got to be the face on the poster. The story of penicillin didn't end with a petri dish in a messy London lab. In many ways, that was only the opening act. The real drama came later, as the world tried to comprehend that a substance scraped from a moldy dish could become the cornerstone of modern medicine. Today, it's easy to take antibiotics for granted. Stub your toe, get an infection, pop a pill, problem solved. But before penicillin, a splinter could be a death sentence. The leap from that terrifying reality to our modern antibiotic arsenal is nothing short of astonishing. When penicillin entered the medical scene in force during the 1940s, it didn't just save soldiers, it rewrote the playbook for civilian healthcare. Hospitals suddenly had a weapon against pneumonia, scarlet fever, syphilis, strep throat, and countless other bacterial nightmares that had been part of the human landscape for millennia. Surgeries became safer because post-operative infections could be treated instead of fatal. A scratched knee no longer carried the same existential dread. Entire medical fields, Organ transplants, joint replacements, complicated childbirth procedures were made possible or vastly safer because of the antibacterial safety net penicillin provided. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual patient care. Epidemics that once crippled communities were suddenly manageable. Death rates plummeted. Average life expectancy ticked upward. In the West, particularly, the mid-20th century saw a medical optimism boom. The belief that science could fix just about anything if you threw enough research at it. It's no coincidence that public health campaigns, mass vaccination drives, and large-scale medical research all surged in the same decades penicillin made its debut. Humanity had seen that microbes could be beaten, and morale soared. Of course, not all the changes were simply medical. Penicillin transformed the pharmaceutical industry into a global powerhouse. Before antibiotics, most drug companies churned out tonics, painkillers, and dubious cure-alls that were more marketing than medicine. But now there was proof, undeniable laboratory-tested proof that chemistry could yield a miracle. That spurred the search for new antibiotics, leading to streptomycin, tetracycline, erythromycin, and a pharmacy aisle's worth of others. These new drugs didn't just treat more infections, they diversified the attack against bacteria, slowing down resistance and expanding humanity's control over disease. And then there was Alexander Fleming himself. Fame hit him like a freight train in the post-war years. Invitations to banquets, honorary degrees from around the globe, newspaper interviews, the man went from quiet lab work to world celebrity. But unlike many who bask in glory, Fleming had a streak of Cassandra in him. He used his newfound platform not just to pose for photographs with mold cultures, but to warn of a lurking danger, bacterial resistance. He famously cautioned that if penicillin were used carelessly, say in too small doses or for illnesses it couldn't treat, bacteria would adapt, rendering it useless. In a prophetic BBC interview, he painted a vivid image of the future, a patient self-medicating incorrectly, surviving, but spreading penicillin-resistant bacteria to others. At the time, such warnings seemed almost paranoid. After all, the drug worked so well. But by the late 20th century, Fleming's words looked eerily prescient. Resistant strains began to emerge, forcing medicine to play a constant game of microbial whack-a-mole. It was a stark reminder that science can give us tools, but it can't make us use them wisely. Still, the legacy of penicillin is unshakable. It's been estimated that antibiotics have saved hundreds of millions, possibly billions of lives since their introduction. Beyond numbers, there's a quieter kind of legacy. The lives lived because of it. The children who grew up instead of dying from scarlet fever. The mothers who survived childbirth infections. The accident victims who recovered instead of succumbing to sepsis. None of them might have thought about the Scottish scientist with the cluttered bench, but they all owed him and the scientists who followed an incalculable debt. Fleming himself lived long enough to see his discovery change the world, though he never stopped being that humble man from Ayrshire. When asked how he found penicillin, he often shrugged and said something along the lines of, "I didn't invent it, nature did. I just happened to notice it." That humility, whether genuine or strategically Scottish, became part of his legend. He died in 1955, a global hero whose funeral was attended by royalty and scientists alike. Today, penicillin is so commonplace it's easy to forget its once revolutionary status, and while its role has shifted, newer antibiotics have taken over some of the heavy lifting. Penicillin remains a frontline weapon in certain cases. In a way, it's like an aging rock star still capable of selling out shows even if it's no longer topping the charts. The irony of it all is that one of the most important medical breakthroughs in human history didn't come from a polished research program or a government-funded think tank. It came from a man who didn't clean up before going on holiday. That accident set off a chain of events that changed the trajectory of global health forever. Billions of lives were saved, whole industries transformed, and humanity's relationship with disease was fundamentally altered. All thanks to a man who couldn't be bothered to clean his petri dishes.